飞鸽制作 飞鸽文学，死寂的微笑。
Sir Hugh Ockram smiled as he sat by the open window of his study, in the late August afternoon, and just then a curiously yellow cloud obscured the low sun, and the clear summer light turned lurid, as if it had been suddenly poisoned and polluted by the foul vapors of a plague. Sir Hugh's face seemed, at best, to be made of fine parchment drawn skin-tight over a wooden mask, in which two eyes were sunk out of sight, and peered from far within through crevices under the slanting, wrinkled lids, alive and watchful like two toads in their holes, side by side and exactly alike. But as the light changed, then a little yellow glare flashed in each. Nurse MacDonald said once that when Sir Hugh smiled, he saw the faces of two women and held two dead women he had betrayed. Nurse MacDonald was 100 years old. And the smile widened, stretching the pale lips across the discolored teeth in an expression of profound self-satisfaction, blended with the most unforgiving hatred and contempt for the human doll. The hideous disease of which he was dying had touched his brain. His son stood beside him, tall, white and delicate as an angel in a primitive picture. And though there was deep distress in his violet eyes as he looked at his father's face, he felt the shadow of that sickening smile stealing across his own lips and parting them and drawing them against his will. And it was like a bad dream, for he tried not to smile and smiled the more. Beside him, strangely like him in her wan, angelic beauty, with the same shadowy golden hair, the same sad violet eyes, the same luminously pale face, Evelyn Warburton rested one hand upon his arm. And as she looked into her uncle's eyes, and could not turn her own away, she knew that the deathly smile was hovering on her own red lips, drawing them tightly across her little teeth, while two bright tears ran down her cheeks to her mouth, and dropped from the upper to the lower lip. While she smiled on, the smile was like the shadow of death and the seal of damnation upon her pure, young face. "Of course," said Sir Hugh very slowly, and still looking out at the trees, "if you have made up your mind to be married, I cannot hinder you, and I don't suppose you attach the smallest importance to my consent." "Father!" exclaimed Gabriel reproachfully. "No, I do not deceive myself," continued the old man, smiling terribly. "You will marry when I am dead, though there is a very good reason why you had better not, he repeated very emphatically. And he slowly turned his toad eyes upon the lovers. "What reason?" asked Evelyn in a frightened voice. "Never mind the reason, my dear. You will marry just as if it did not exist." There was a long pause. "Two gone," he said, his voice lowering strangely, "and two more will be four altogether for ever and ever, burning, burning, burning bright." At the last words his head sank slowly back, and the little glare of the toad eyes disappeared under the swollen lids. And the lurid cloud passed from the westering sun, so that the earth was green again and the light pure. Sir Hugh had fallen asleep, as he often did in his last illness, even while speaking. Gabriel Ockram drew Evelyn away, and from the study they went out into the dim hall, softly closing the door behind them, and each audibly drew breath, as though some sudden danger had been passed. They laid their hands each in the other's, and their strangely like eyes met in a long look, in which love and perfect understanding were darkened by the secret terror of an unknown thing. Their pale faces reflected each other's fear. "It is his secret," said Evelyn at last. "He will never tell us what it is." "If he dies with it," answered Gabriel, "let it be on his own head." "On his head?" echoed the dim hall. It was a strange echo, and some were frightened by it, for they said that if it were a real echo it should repeat everything and not give back a phrase here and there. Now speaking, now silent. But Nurse MacDonald said that the great hall would never echo a prayer when an Ockram was to die, though it would give back curses 10 for 1. "On his head," it repeated quite softly, and Evelyn started and looked round. "It is only the echo," said Gabriel, leading her away. They went out into the late afternoon light, and sat upon a stone seat behind the chapel, which was built across the end of the east wing. It was very still. Not a breath stirred, and there was no sound near them. Only far off in the park a songbird was whistling the high prelude to the evening chorus. "It is very lonely here," said Evelyn, taking Gabriel's hand nervously, and speaking as if she dreaded to disturb the silence. "If it were dark, I should be afraid." "Of what?" "Of me?" Gabriel's sad eyes turned to her. "Oh no. How could I be afraid of you? But of the old Ockrams. They say they are just under our feet here in the north vault outside the chapel. All in their shrouds, with no coffins, as they used to bury them. As they always will, as they will bury my father and me. They say an Ockram will not lie in a coffin. But it cannot be true. These are fairy tales. Ghost stories." Evelyn nestled nearer to her companion, grasping his hand more tightly, and the sun began to go down. "Of course. But there is the story of old Sir Vernon, who was beheaded for treason under James II. The family brought his body back from the scaffold in an iron coffin with heavy locks. And they put it in the north vault. But ever afterwards, whenever the vault was opened to bury another of the family, they found the coffin wide open, and the body standing upright against the wall, and the head rolled away in a corner, smiling at it. As Uncle Hugh smiles? Evelyn shivered. Yes, I suppose so, answered Gabriel, thoughtfully. Of course I never saw it, and the vault has not been opened for 30 years. None of us have died since then. And if Uncle Hugh dies, shall you? Evelyn stopped, and her beautiful thin face was quite white. Yes. I shall see him laid there too, with his secret, whatever it is. Gabriel sighed and pressed the girl's little hand. I do not like to think of it, she said unsteadily. Oh, Gabriel, what can the secret be? He said we had better not marry, not that he forbade it, but he said it so strangely, and he smiled. Ugh. Her small white teeth chattered with fear, and she looked over her shoulder while drawing still closer to Gabriel. And, somehow, I felt it in my own face. So did I, answered Gabriel in a low, nervous voice. Nurse MacDonald, he stopped abruptly. What? What did she say? Oh, nothing. She has told me things they would frighten you, dear. Come, it is growing chilly. He rose, but Evelyn held his hand in both of hers, still sitting and looking up into his face. But we shall be married, just the same, Gabriel. Say that we shall. Of course, darling, of course. But while my father is so very ill, it is impossible. Oh, Gabriel, Gabriel, dear. I wish we were married now," cried Evelyn in sudden distress. "I know that something will prevent it and keep us apart." "Nothing shall." "Nothing?" "Nothing human," said Gabriel Ockram as she drew him down to her. And their faces, that were so strangely alike, met and touched, and Gabriel knew that the kiss had a marvelous savor of evil, but on Evelyn's lips it was like the cool breath of a sweet and mortal fear. And neither of them understood, for they were innocent and young. Yet she drew him to her by her lightest touch, as a sensitive plant shivers and waves its thin leaves, and bends and closes softly upon what it wants, and he let himself be drawn to her willingly, as he would if her touch had been deadly and poisonous, for she strangely loved that half-voluptuous breath of fear, and he passionately desired the nameless evil something that lurked in her maiden lips. "It is as if we loved in a strange dream," she said. "I fear the waking," he murmured. "We shall not wake, dear. When the dream is over it will have already turned into death, so softly that we shall not know it. But until then," she paused, and her eyes sought his. And their faces slowly came nearer. It was as if they had thoughts in their red lips that foresaw and foreknew the deep kiss of each other. "Until then," she said again, very low, and her mouth was nearer to his. "Dream till then," murmured his breath. Chapter 2. Nurse MacDonald was 100 years old. She used to sleep sitting all bent together in a great old leathern armchair with wings, her feet in a bag footstool lined with sheepskin, and many warm blankets wrapped about her, even in summer. Beside her a little lamp always burned at night by an old silver cup, in which there was something to drink. Her face was very wrinkled, but the wrinkles were so small and fine and near together that they made shadows instead of lines. 2 thin locks of hair, that was turning from white to a smoky yellow again, were drawn over her temples from under her starched white cap. Every now and then she woke, and her eyelids were drawn up in tiny folds like little pink silk curtains. And her queer blue eyes looked straight before her through doors and walls and worlds to a far place beyond. Then she slept again, and her hands lay one upon the other on the edge of the blanket. The thumbs had grown longer than the fingers with age, and the joints shone in the low lamplight like polished crabapples. It was nearly 1 o'clock in the night, and the summer breeze was blowing the ivy branch against the panes of the window with a hushing caress. In the small room beyond, with the door ajar, the girl-maid who took care of Nurse MacDonald was fast asleep. All was very quiet. The old woman breathed regularly, and her indrawn lips trembled each time as the breath went out, and her eyes were shut. But outside the closed window there was a face, and violet eyes were looking steadily at the ancient sleeper, for it was like the face of Evelyn Warburton, though there were 80 feet from the sill of the window to the foot of the tower. Yet the cheeks were thinner than Evelyn's, and as white as a gleam, and the eyes stared, and the lips were not red with life, they were dead, and painted with new blood. Slowly Nurse MacDonald's wrinkled eyelids folded themselves back, and she looked straight at the face at the window, while one might count 10. "Is it time?" she asked in her little old, faraway voice. While she looked the face at the window changed, for the eyes opened wider and wider, till the white glared all round the bright violet. And the bloody lips opened over gleaming teeth, and stretched and widened and stretched again, and the shadowy golden hair rose and streamed against the window in the night breeze. And in answer to Nurse MacDonald's question came the sound that freezes the living flesh. That low moaning voice that rises suddenly, like the scream of storm, from a moan to a wail, from a wail to a howl, from a howl to the fierce shriek of the tortured dead. He who has heard knows, and he can bear witness that the cry of the banshee is an evil cry to hear alone in the deep night. When it was over and the face was gone, Nurse MacDonald shook a little in her great chair, and still she looked at the black square of the window, but there was nothing more there, nothing but the night and the whispering ivy branch. She turned her head to the door that was ajar, and there stood the girl in her white gown, her teeth chattering with fright. "It is time, child," said Nurse MacDonald. "I must go to him, for it is the end." She rose slowly, leaning her withered hands upon the arms of the chair, and the girl brought her a woolen gown and a great mantle, and her crutch stick, and made her ready. But very often the girl looked at the window and was unjointed with fear. And often Nurse MacDonald shook her head and said words which the maid could not understand. "It was like the face of Miss Evelyn," said the girl at last, trembling. But the ancient woman looked up sharply and angrily, and her queer blue eyes glared. She held herself by the arm of the great chair with her left hand, and lifted up her crutch stick to strike the maid with all her might. But she did not. "You are a good girl," she said, "but you are a fool. Pray for wit, child, pray for wit, or else find service in another house than Auckram Hall. Bring the lamp and help me under my left arm." The crutch stick clacked on the wooden floor, and the low heels of the woman's slippers clappered after her in slow triplets, as Nurse MacDonald got toward the door. And down the stairs each step she took was a labor in itself, and by the clacking noise the waking servants knew that she was coming. Very long before they saw her. No one was sleeping now, and there were lights, and whisperings, and pale faces in the corridors near Sir Hugh's bedroom, and now someone went in, and now someone came out. But every one made way for Nurse MacDonald, who had nursed Sir Hugh's father more than 80 years ago. The light was soft and clear in the room. There stood Gabriel Auckram by his father's bedside, and there knelt Evelyn Warburton, her hair lying like a golden shadow down her shoulders, and her hands clasped nervously together. And opposite Gabriel, a nurse was trying to make Sir Hugh drink. But he would not, and though his lips were parted, his teeth were set. He was very, very thin and yellow now, and his eyes caught the light sideways and were as yellow coals. "Do not torment him," said Nurse MacDonald to the woman who held the cup. "Let me speak to him, for his hour is come." "Let her speak to him," said Gabriel in a dull voice. So the ancient woman leaned to the pillow and laid the feather-weight of her withered hand, that was like a brown moth, upon Sir Hugh's yellow fingers, and she spoke to him earnestly, while only Gabriel and Evelyn were left in the room to hear. "Hugh Auckram," she said, "this is the end of your life, and as I saw you born, and saw your father born before you, I am come to see you die. Hugh Auckram, will you tell me the truth?" The dying man recognized the little faraway voice he had known all his life, and he very slowly turned his yellow face to Nurse MacDonald, but he said nothing. Then she spoke again. "Hugh Ockram, you will never see the daylight again. Will you tell the truth?" His toad-like eyes were not yet dull. They fastened themselves on her face. "What do you want of me?" he asked, and each word struck hollow upon the last. "I have no secrets. I have lived a good life." Nurse MacDonald laughed a tiny, cracked laugh that made her old head bob and tremble a little, as if her neck were on a steel spring. But Sir Hugh's eyes grew red, and his pale lips began to twist. "Let me die in peace," he said slowly. But Nurse MacDonald shook her head, and her brown, moth-like hand left his and fluttered to his forehead. "By the mother that bore you and died of grief for the sins you did. Tell me the truth." Sir Hugh's lips tightened on his discolored teeth. "Not on earth," he answered slowly. "By the wife who bore your son and died heartbroken, tell me the truth. Neither to you in life, nor to her in eternal death." His lips writhed, as if the words were coals between them, and a great drop of sweat rolled across the parchment of his forehead. Gabriel Ockram bit his hand as he watched his father die. But Nurse MacDonald spoke a third time. "By the woman whom you betrayed, and who waits for you this night, Hugh Ockram, tell me the truth. It is too late. Let me die in peace." The writhing lips began to smile across the set yellow teeth, and the toad eyes glowed like evil jewels in his head. "There is time," said the ancient woman. "Tell me the name of Evelyn Warburton's father. Then I will let you die in peace." Evelyn started back, kneeling as she was, and stared at Nurse MacDonald, and then at her uncle. "The name of Evelyn's father?" he repeated slowly, while the awful smile spread upon his dying face. The light was growing strangely dim in the great room. As Evelyn looked, Nurse MacDonald's crooked shadow on the wall grew gigantic. Sir Hugh's breath came thick, rattling in his throat, as death crept in like a snake and choked it back. Evelyn prayed aloud, high and clear. Then something rapped at the window, and she felt her hair rise upon her head in a cool breeze. As she looked around in spite of herself, and when she saw her own white face looking in at the window, and her own eyes staring at her through the glass, wide and fearful, and her own hair streaming against the pane, and her own lips dashed with blood, she rose slowly from the floor and stood rigid for one moment, till she screamed once and fell straight back into Gabriel's arms. But the shriek that answered hers was the shriek of the tormented corpse, out of which the soul cannot pass for shame of deadly sins, though the devils fight in it with corruption, each for their due share. Sir Hugh Ockram sat upright in his deathbed, and saw and cried aloud. "Evelyn!" His harsh voice broke and rattled in his chest as he sank down. But still Nurse MacDonald tortured him, for there was a little life left in him still. "You have seen the mother as she waits for you, Hugh Ockram. Who was this girl Evelyn's father? What was his name?" For the last time the dreadful smile came upon the twisted lips, very slowly, very surely now, and the toad eyes glared red, and the parchment face glowed a little in the flickering light. For the last time words came. they know it in hell." Then the glowing eyes went out quickly, the yellow face turned waxen pale, and a great shiver ran through the thin body as Hugh Ockram died. But in death he still smiled. For he knew his secret and kept it still, on the other side, and he would take it with him, to lie with him for ever in the north vault of the chapel, where the Ockrams lie uncoffined in their shrouds. All but one. Though he was dead, he smiled, for he had kept his treasure of evil truth to the end, and there was none left to tell the name he had spoken, but there was all the evil he had not undone left to bear fruit. As they watched Nurse MacDonald and Gabriel, who held Evelyn still unconscious in his arms while he looked at the father, they felt the dead smile crawling along their own lips, the ancient crone and the youth with the angel's face. Then they shivered a little. And both looked at Evelyn as she lay with her head on his shoulder, and, though she was very beautiful, the same sickening smile was twisting her young mouth too, and it was like the foreshadowing of a great evil which they could not understand. But by and by they carried Evelyn out, and she opened her eyes and the smile was gone. From far away in the great house, the sound of weeping and crooning came up the stairs, and echoed along the dismal corridors. For the women had begun to mourn the dead master, after the Irish fashion, and the hall had echoes of its own all that night, like the far-off wail of the banshee among forest trees. When the time was come, they took Sir Hugh in his winding sheet on a trestle bier, and bore him to the chapel and through the iron door and down the long descent to the north vault, with tapers, to lay him by his father. And 2 men went in first to prepare the place, and came back staggering like drunken men, and white, leaving their lights behind them. But Gabriel Ockram was not afraid, for he knew. And he went in alone, and saw that the body of Sir Vernon Ockram was leaning upright against the stone wall, and that its head lay on the ground near by with the face turned up, and the dried leathern lips smiled horribly at the dried-up corpse, while the iron coffin, lined with black velvet, stood open on the floor. Then Gabriel took the thing in his hands, for it was very light, being quite dried by the air of the vault, and those who peeped in from the door saw him lay it in the coffin again, and it rustled a little, like a bundle of reeds, and sounded hollow as it touched the sides and the bottom. He also placed the head upon the shoulders, and shut down the lid, which fell to with a rusty spring that snapped. After that they laid Sir Hugh beside his father, with the trestle bier on which they had brought him, and they went back to the chapel. But when they saw one another's faces, master and men, they were all smiling with the dead smile of the corpse they had left in the vault, so that they could not bear to look at one another until it had faded away. Chapter 3 Gabriel Ockram became Sir Gabriel, inheriting the baronetcy with the half-ruined fortune left by his father, and still Evelyn Warburton lived at Ockram Hall, in the south room that had been hers ever since she could remember anything. She could not go away, for there were no relatives to whom she could have gone, and, besides, there seemed to be no reason why she should not stay. The world would never trouble itself to care what the Ockrams did on their Irish estates, and it was long since the Ockrams had asked anything of the world. So Sir Gabriel took his father's place at the dark old table in the dining room, and Evelyn sat opposite to him until such time as their mourning should be over, and they might be married at last. And meanwhile their lives went on as before, since Sir Hugh had been a hopeless invalid during the last year of his life. And they had seen him but once a day for a little while, spending most of their time together in a strangely perfect companionship. But though the late summer saddened into autumn, and autumn darkened into winter, and storm followed storm, and rain poured on rain through the short days and the long nights, yet Aughrim Hall seemed less gloomy since Sir Hugh had been laid in the north vault beside his father. And at Christmastide Evelyn decked the great hall with holly and green boughs, and huge fires blazed on every hearth. Then the tenants were all bidden to a New Year's dinner, and they ate and drank well, while Sir Gabriel sat at the head of the table. Evelyn came in when the port wine was brought, and the most respected of the tenants made a speech to propose her health. It was long, he said, since there had been a Lady Aughrim. Sir Gabriel shaded his eyes with his hand and looked down at the table. But a faint colour came into Evelyn's transparent cheeks. But, said the grey-haired farmer, it was longer still since there had been a Lady Aughrim so fair as the next was to be, and he gave the health of Evelyn Warburton. Then the tenants all stood up and shouted for her, and Sir Gabriel stood up likewise, beside Evelyn. And when the men gave the last and loudest cheer of all, there was a voice, not theirs, above them all. Higher, fiercer, louder a scream not earthly, shrieking for the bride of Aughrim Hall. And the holly and the green boughs over the great chimney-piece shook and slowly waved as if a cool breeze were blowing over them. But the men turned very pale, and many of them set down their glasses, but others let them fall upon the floor for fear. And looking into one another's faces, they were all smiling, strangely, a dead smile, like dead Sir Hugh's. One cried out words in Irish, and the fear of death was suddenly upon them all, so that they fled in panic, falling over one another like wild beasts in the burning forest, when the thick smoke runs along before the flame, and the tables were over set, and drinking glasses and bottles were broken in heaps, and the dark red wine crawled like blood upon the polished floor. Sir Gabriel and Evelyn stood alone at the head of the table, before the wreck of the feast, not daring to turn to see each other, for each knew that the other smiled. But his right arm held her and his left hand clasped her right as they stared before them, and but for the shadows of her hair one might not have told their two faces apart. They listened long, but the cry came not again, and the dead smile faded from their lips, while each remembered that Sir Hugh Aughrim lay in the north vault, smiling in his winding sheet, in the dark, because he had died with his secret. So ended the tenants' New Year's dinner. But from that time on Sir Gabriel grew more and more silent, and his face grew even paler and thinner than before. Often, without warning and without words, he would rise from his seat, as if something moved him against his will, and he would go out into the rain or the sunshine to the north side of the chapel, and sit on the stone bench, staring at the ground as if he could see through it, and through the vault below, and through the white winding sheet in the dark, to the dead smile that would not die. Always when he went out in that way, Evelyn came out presently and sat beside him. Once, too, as in summer, their beautiful faces came suddenly near, and their lids drooped, and their red lips were almost joined together. But as their eyes met, they grew wide and wild, so that the white showed in a ring all round the deep violet. And their teeth chattered, and their hands were like hands of corpses, each in the other's, for the terror of what was under their feet, and of what they knew but could not see. Once, also, Evelyn found Sir Gabriel in the chapel alone, standing before the iron door that led down to the place of death, and in his hand there was the key to the door, but he had not put it into the lock. Evelyn drew him away, shivering, for she had also been driven in waking dreams to see that terrible thing again, and to find out whether it had changed since it had lain there. "I'm going mad," said Sir Gabriel, covering his eyes with his hand as he went with her. "I see it in my sleep, I see it when I am awake. It draws me to it, day and night, and unless I see it I shall die." "I know," answered Evelyn, "I know. It is as if threads were spun from it, like a spider's, drawing us down to it." She was silent for a moment, and then she started violently and grasped his arm with a man's strength, and almost screamed the words she spoke. "But we must not go there," she cried. "We must not go." Sir Gabriel's eyes were half shut, and he was not moved by the agony of her face. "I shall die, unless I see it again," he said, in a quiet voice, not like his own. And all that day and that evening he scarcely spoke, thinking of it, always thinking, while Evelyn Warburton quivered from head to foot with a terror she had never known. She went alone, on a grey winter's morning, to Nurse MacDonald's room in the tower, and sat down beside the great leathern easy-chair, laying her thin white hand upon the withered fingers. "Nurse," she said, "what was it that Uncle Hugh should have told you that night before he died? It must have been an awful secret, and yet, though you asked him, I feel somehow that you know it, and that you know why he used to smile so dreadfully." The old woman's head moved slowly from side to side. "I only guess I shall never know," she answered slowly in her cracked little voice. "But what do you guess?" "Who am I?" "Why did you ask who my father was?" "You know I am Colonel Warburton's daughter, and my mother was Lady Auckram's sister, so that Gabriel and I are cousins. My father was killed in Afghanistan." "What secret can there be?" "I do not know. I can only guess." "Guess what?" asked Evelyn imploringly, and pressing the soft withered hands as she leaned forward. But Nurse MacDonald's wrinkled lids dropped suddenly over her queer blue eyes, and her lips shook a little with her breath, as if she were asleep. Evelyn waited. By the fire the Irish maid was knitting fast, and the needles clicked like 3 or 4 clocks ticking against each other. And the real clock on the wall solemnly ticked alone, checking off the seconds of the woman who was 100 years old, and had not many days left. Outside the ivy branch beat the window in the wintry blast, as it had beaten against the glass 100 years ago. Then as Evelyn sat there, she felt again the waking of a horrible desire, the sickening wish to go down to the thing in the north vault, and to open the winding sheet, and see whether it had changed, and she held Nurse MacDonald's hands as if to keep herself in her place, and fight against the appalling attraction of the evil dead. But the old cat that kept Nurse MacDonald's feet warm, lying always on the bag footstool, got up and stretched itself, and looked up into Evelyn's eyes, while its back arched, and its tail thickened and bristled, and its ugly pink lips drew back in a devilish grin, showing its sharp teeth. Evelyn stared at it, half fascinated by its ugliness. Then the creature suddenly put out one paw with all its claws spread, and spat at the girl, and all at once the grinning cat was like the smiling corpse far down below. So that Evelyn shivered down to her small feet, and covered her face with her free hand, lest Nurse MacDonald should wake and see the dead smile there, for she could feel it. The old woman had already opened her eyes again, and she touched her cat with the end of her crutch stick, whereupon its back went down and its tail shrunk, and it sidled back to its place on the bag footstool. But its yellow eyes looked up sideways at Evelyn, between the slits of its lids. "What is it that you guess, nurse?" asked the young girl again. "A bad thing, a wicked thing. But I dare not tell you, lest it might not be true, and the very thought should blast your life. For if I guess right, he meant that you should not know, and that you two should marry, and pay for his old sin with your souls. He used to tell us that we ought not to marry. Yes, he told you that. Perhaps, but it was as if a man put poisoned meat before a starving beast, and said do not eat, but never raised his hand to take the meat away. And if he told you that you should not marry, it was because he hoped you would. For of all men living or dead, Hugh Ockram was the falsest man that ever told a cowardly lie, and the cruelest that ever hurt a weak woman, and the worst that ever loved a sin. But Gabriel and I love each other," said Evelyn very sadly. Nurse MacDonald's old eyes looked far away, at sights seen long ago, and that rose in the grey winter air amid the mists of an ancient youth. "If you love, you can die together," she said, very slowly. "Why should you live, if it is true? I am 100 years old. What has life given me? The beginning is fire, the end is a heap of ashes, and between the end and the beginning lies all the pain of the world. Let me sleep, since I cannot die." Then the old woman's eyes closed again, and her head sank a little lower upon her breast. So Evelyn went away and left her asleep, with the cat asleep on the bag footstool. And the young girl tried to forget Nurse MacDonald's words, but she could not, for she heard them over and over again in the wind, and behind her on the stairs. And as she grew sick with fear of the frightful unknown evil to which her soul was bound, she felt a bodily something pressing her, and pushing her, and forcing her on, and from the other side she felt the threads that drew her mysteriously, and when she shut her eyes, she saw in the chapel behind the altar the low iron door through which she must pass to go to the thing. And as she lay awake at night, she drew the sheet over her face, lest she should see shadows on the wall beckoning to her. And the sound of her own warm breath made whisperings in her ears, while she held the mattress with her hands, to keep from getting up and going to the chapel. It would have been easier if there had not been a way thither through the library, by a door which was never locked. It would be fearfully easy to take her candle and go softly through the sleeping house. And the key of the vault lay under the altar, behind a stone that turned. She knew the little secret. She could go alone and see. But when she thought of it, she felt her hair rise on her head, and first she shivered so that the bed shook, and then the horror went through her in a cold thrill that was agony again, like myriads of icy needles boring into her nerves. Chapter 4. The old clock in Nurse MacDonald's tower struck midnight. From her room, she could hear the creaking chains and weights in their box in the corner of the staircase, and overhead the jarring of the rusty lever that lifted the hammer. She had heard it all her life. It struck 11 strokes clearly, and then came the 12th, with a dull half-stroke, as though the hammer were too weary to go on, and had fallen asleep against the bell. The old cat got up from the bag footstool and stretched itself, and Nurse MacDonald opened her ancient eyes, and looked slowly round the room by the dim light of the night lamp. She touched the cat with her crutch stick, and it lay down upon her feet. She drank a few drops from her cup and went to sleep again. But downstairs Sir Gabriel sat straight up as the clock struck, for he had dreamed a fearful dream of horror. And his heart stood still, till he awoke at its stopping, and it beat again furiously with his breath, like a wild thing set free. No Ockram had ever known fear waking, but sometimes it came to Sir Gabriel in his sleep. He pressed his hands to his temples as he sat up in bed, and his hands were icy cold, but his head was hot. The dream faded far, and in its place there came the master thought that racked his life. With the thought also came the sick twisting of his lips in the dark that would have been a smile. Far off, Evelyn Warburton dreamed that the dead smile was on her mouth, and awoke, starting with a little moan, her face in her hands, shivering. But Sir Gabriel struck a light and got up and began to walk up and down his great room. It was midnight, and he had barely slept an hour, and in the north of Ireland the winter nights are long. "I shall go mad," he said to himself, holding his forehead. He knew that it was true. For weeks and months, the possession of the thing had grown upon him like a disease, till he could think of nothing without thinking first of that. And now all at once it outgrew his strength, and he knew that he must be its instrument or lose his mind, that he must do the deed he hated and feared, if he could fear anything, or that something would snap in his brain and divide him from life while he was yet alive. He took the candlestick in his hand, the old-fashioned heavy candlestick that had always been used by the head of the house. He did not think of dressing, but went as he was, in his silk night clothes and his slippers. And he opened the door. Everything was very still in the great old house. He shut the door behind him and walked noiselessly on the carpet through the long corridor. A cool breeze blew over his shoulder and blew the flame of his candle straight out from him. Instinctively he stopped and looked round, but all was still, and the upright flame burned steadily. He walked on, and instantly a strong draught was behind him, almost extinguishing the light. It seemed to blow him on his way, ceasing whenever he turned, coming again when he went on invisible, icy. Down the great staircase to the echoing hall he went, seeing nothing but the flaring flame of the candle standing away from him over the guttering wax, while the cold wind blew over his shoulder and through his hair. On he passed through the open door into the library, dark with old books and carved bookcases, on through the door and the shelves, with painted shelves on it, and the imitated backs of books, so that one needed to know where to find it. And it shut itself after him with a soft click. He entered the low-arched passage, and though the door was shut behind him and fitted tightly in its frame, still the cold breeze blew the flame forward as he walked. And he was not afraid, but his face was very pale, and his eyes were wide and bright, looking before him, seeing already in the dark air the picture of the thing beyond. But in the chapel he stood still, his hand on the little turning stone tablet in the back of the stone altar. On the tablet were engraved words, _clavis sepulchri clarissimorum dominorum de Ochram _, the key to the vault of the most illustrious lords of Ochram. Sir Gabriel paused and listened. He fancied that he heard a sound far off in the great house where all had been so still, but it did not come again. Yet he waited at the last, and looked at the low iron door. Beyond it, down the long descent, lay his father uncoffined, 6 months dead, corrupt, terrible in his clinging shroud. The strangely preserving air of the vault could not yet have done its work completely. But on the thing's ghastly features, with their half-dried, open eyes, there would still be the frightful smile with which the man had died, the smile that haunted. As the thought crossed Sir Gabriel's mind, he felt his lips writhing, and he struck his own mouth in wrath with the back of his hand so fiercely that a drop of blood ran down his chin. And another, and more, falling back in the gloom upon the chapel pavement. But still his bruised lips twisted themselves. He turned the tablet by the simple secret. It needed no safer fastening, for had each Ochram been coffined in pure gold, and had the door been open wide, there was not a man in Tyrone brave enough to go down to that place, saving Gabriel Ochram himself, with his angel's face and his thin, white hands, and his sad unflinching eyes. He took the great old key, and set it into the lock of the iron door, and the heavy, rattling noise echoed down the descent beyond like footsteps, as if a watcher had stood behind the iron and were running away within, with heavy dead feet. And though he was standing still, the cool wind was from behind him, and blew the flame of the candle against the iron panel. He turned the key. Sir Gabriel saw that his candle was short. There were new ones on the altar, with long candlesticks, and he lit one, and left his own burning on the floor. As he set it down on the pavement, his lip began to bleed again, and another drop fell upon the stones. He drew the iron door open and pushed it back against the chapel wall, so that it should not shut of itself, while he was within, and the horrible draught of the sepulchre came up out of the depths in his face, foul and dark. He went in, but though the fetid air met him, yet the flame of the tall candle was blown straight from him against the wind, while he walked down the easy incline with steady steps, his loose slippers slapping the pavement as he trod. He shaded the candle with his hand, and his fingers seemed to be made of wax and blood as the light shone through them. And in spite of him, the unearthly draught forced the flame forward, till it was blue over the black wick. And it seemed as if it must go out. But he went straight on, with shining eyes. The downward passage was wide, and he could not always see the walls by the struggling light, but he knew when he was in the place of death by the larger, drearier echo of his steps in the greater space, and by the sensation of a distant blank wall. He stood still, almost enclosing the flame of the candle in the hollow of his hand. He could see a little, for his eyes were growing used to the gloom. Shadowy forms were outlined in the dimness, where the biers of the Ochram stood crowded together, side by side, each with its straight, shrouded corpse, strangely preserved by the dry air, like the empty shell that the locust sheds in summer. And a few steps before him he saw clearly the dark shape of headless Sir Vernon's iron coffin, and he knew that nearest to it lay the thing he sought. He was as brave as any of those dead men had been, and they were his father's, and he knew that sooner or later he should lie there himself, beside Sir Hugh, slowly drying to a parchment shell. But he was still alive. And he closed his eyes a moment, and 3 great drops stood on his forehead. Then he looked again, and by the whiteness of the winding sheet he knew his father's corpse, for all the others were brown with age. And, moreover, the flame of the candle was blown toward it. He made 4 steps till he reached it, and suddenly the light burned straight and high, shedding a dazzling yellow glare upon the fine linen that was all white, save over the face, and where the joined hands were laid on the breast. And at those places ugly stains had spread, darkened with outlines of the features and of the tight-clasped fingers. There was a frightful stench of drying death. As Sir Gabriel looked down, something stirred behind him, softly at first, then more noisily, and something fell to the stone floor with a dull thud and rolled up to his feet. He started back and saw a withered head lying almost face upward on the pavement, grinning at him. He felt the cold sweat standing on his face, and his heart beat painfully. For the first time in all his life that evil thing which men call fear was getting hold of him, checking his heart. Strings as a cruel driver checks a quivering horse, clawing at his backbone with icy hands, lifting his hair with freezing breath, climbing up and gathering in his midriff with leaden weight. Yet presently he bit his lip and bent down, holding the candle in one hand, to lift the shroud back from the head of the corpse with the other. Slowly he lifted it. Then it clove to the half-dried skin of the face, and his hand shook as if someone had struck him on the elbow. But half in fear and half in anger at himself, he pulled it, so that it came away with a little ripping sound. He caught his breath as he held it, not yet throwing it back, and not yet looking. The horror was working in him, and he felt that old Vernon Ockram was standing up in his iron coffin, headless, yet watching him with the stump of his severed neck. While he held his breath, he felt the dead smile twisting his lips. In sudden wrath at his own misery, he tossed the death-stained linen backward, and looked at last. He ground his teeth, lest he should shriek aloud. There it was, the thing that haunted him, that haunted Evelyn Warburton, that was like a blight on all that came near him. The dead face was blotched with dark stains, and the thin, grey hair was matted about the discolored forehead. The sunken lids were half open, and the candle light gleamed on something foul where the toad eyes had lived. But yet the dead thing smiled, as it had smiled in life. The ghastly lips were parted and drawn wide and tight upon the wolfish teeth, cursing still, and still defying hell to do its worst, defying, cursing, and always and forever smiling alone in the dark. Sir Gabriel opened the winding sheet where the hands were, and the blackened, withered fingers were closed upon something stained and mottled. Shivering from head to foot, but fighting like a man in agony for his life, he tried to take the package from the dead man's hold. But as he pulled at it, the claw-like fingers seemed to close more tightly, and when he pulled harder the shrunken hands and arms rose from the corpse, with a horrible look of life following his motion. Then, as he wrenched the sealed packet loose at last, the hands fell back into their place still folded. He set down the candle on the edge of the bier, to break the seals from the stout paper. And, kneeling on one knee, to get a better light, he read what was within. Written long ago in Sir Hugh's queer hand. He was no longer afraid. He read how Sir Hugh had written it all down, that it might perchance be a witness of evil and of his hatred, how he had loved Evelyn Warburton, his wife's sister, and how his wife had died of a broken heart with his curse upon her, and how Warburton and he had fought side by side in Afghanistan, and Warburton had fallen, but Auckram had brought his comrade's wife back a full year later, and little Evelyn, her child, had been born in Auckram Hall. And next, how he had wearied of the mother, and she had died like her sister with his curse on her. And then, how Evelyn had been brought up as his niece, and how he had trusted that his son Gabriel and his daughter, innocent and unknowing, might love and marry, and the souls of the women he had betrayed might suffer another anguish before eternity was out. And, last of all, he hoped that some day, when nothing could be undone, the two might find his writing and live on, not daring to tell the truth for their children's sake and the world's word, man and wife. This he read, kneeling beside the corpse in the north vault, by the light of the altar candle, and when he had read it all, he thanked God aloud that he had found the secret in time. But when he rose to his feet and looked down at the dead face, it was changed. And the smile was gone from it forever, and the jaw had fallen a little, and the tired, dead lips were relaxed. And then there was a breath behind him and close to him, not cold like that which had blown the flame of the candle as he came, but warm and human. He turned suddenly. There she stood, all in white, with her shadowy golden hair, for she had risen from her bed and had followed him noiselessly, and had found him reading, and had herself read over his shoulder. He started violently when he saw her, for his nerves were unstrung, and then he cried out her name in the still place of death, "Evelyn!" "My brother!" She answered softly and tenderly, putting out both hands to meet his. The screaming skull, I have often heard it scream. No, I am not nervous, I am not imaginative, and I never believed in ghosts, unless that thing is one. Whatever it is, it hates me almost as much as it hated Luke Pratt, and it screams at me. If I were you, I would never tell ugly stories about ingenious ways of killing people, for you never can tell, but that someone at the table may be tired of his or her nearest and dearest. I have always blamed myself for Mrs. Pratt's death, and I suppose I was responsible for it in a way, though heaven knows I never wished her anything but long life and happiness. If I had not told that story, she might be alive yet. That is why the thing screams at me. I fancy. She was a good little woman, with a sweet temper, all things considered, and a nice gentle voice, but I remember hearing her shriek once when she thought her little boy was killed by a pistol that went off, though every one was sure that it was not loaded. It was the same scream, exactly the same, with a sort of rising quaver at the end. Do you know what I mean? Unmistakable. The truth is, I had not realized that the doctor and his wife were not on good terms. They used to bicker a bit now and then when I was here, and I often noticed that little Mrs. Pratt got very red and bit her lip hard to keep her temper, while Luke grew pale and said the most offensive things. He was that sort when he was in the nursery, I remember, and afterward at school. He was my cousin, you know. That is how I came by this house, after he died, and his boy Charlie was killed in South Africa. There were no relations left. Yes, it's a pretty little property, just the sort of thing for an old sailor like me who has taken to gardening. One always remembers one's mistakes much more vividly than one's cleverest things. Doesn't one? I've often noticed it. I was dining with the Pratts one night, when I told them the story that afterwards made so much difference. It was a wet night in November, and the sea was moaning. Hush! If you don't speak you will hear it now. Do you hear the tide? Gloomy sound, isn't it? Sometimes, about this time of year, hello, there it is. Don't be frightened, man, it won't eat you, it's only a noise, after all. But I am glad you've heard it, because there are always people who think it's the wind, or my imagination, or something. You won't hear it again tonight, I fancy, for it doesn't often come more than once. Yes, that's right. Put another stick on the fire. And a little more stuff into that weak mixture you're so fond of. Do you remember old Blocklet the carpenter, on that German ship that picked us up when the _Clontarf_ went to the bottom? We were hove to in a howling gale one night. As snug as you please, with no land within 500 miles, and the ship coming up and falling off as regularly as clockwork. Biddy te bore beebles ashore 'tis night, poise. Old Blocklet sang out, as he went off to his quarters with the sail maker. I often think of that, now that I'm ashore for good and all. Yes, it was on a night like this, when I was at home for a spell, waiting to take the _Olympia out on her first trip. It was on the next voyage that she broke the record. You remember, but that dates it. 92 was the year, early in November. The weather was dirty, Pratt was out of temper, and the dinner was bad, very bad indeed, which didn't improve matters, and cold, which made it worse. The poor little lady was very unhappy about it, and insisted on making a Welsh rarebit on the table to counteract the raw turnips and the half-boiled mutton. Pratt must have had a hard day. Perhaps he had lost a patient. At all events, he was in a nasty temper. My wife is trying to poison me, you see, he said. She'll succeed some day. I saw that she was hurt, and I made believe to laugh, and said that Mrs. Pratt was much too clever to get rid of her husband in such a simple way. And then I began to tell them about Japanese tricks with spun glass, and chopped horsehair, and the like. Pratt was a doctor, and knew a lot more than I did about such things, but that only put me on my mettle. And I told a story about a woman in Ireland who did for 3 husbands, before anyone suspected foul play. Did you never hear that tale? The 4th husband managed to keep awake and caught her, and she was hanged. How did she do it? She drugged them, and poured melted lead into their ears through a little horn funnel when they were asleep. No, that's the wind whistling. It's backing up to the southward again. I can tell by the sound. Besides, the other thing doesn't often come more than once in an evening, even at this time of year when it happened. Yes, it was in November. Poor Mrs. Pratt died suddenly in her bed not long after I dined here. I can fix the date, because I got the news in New York by the steamer that followed the Olympia when I took her out on her first trip. You had the Leofric the same year? Yes, I remember. What a pair of old buffers we are coming to be. You and I. Nearly 50 years since we were apprentices together on the Clontarf _. Shall you ever forget old Blocklet? Biddy te bor beebles ashore, poise. Ha, ha. Take a little more, with all that water. It's the old Hulstkamp I found in the cellar when this house came to me. The same I brought Luke from Amsterdam 25 years ago. He had never touched a drop of it. Perhaps he's sorry now, poor fellow. Where did I leave off? I told you that Mrs. Pratt died suddenly, yes. Luke must have been lonely here after she was dead. I should think. I came to see him now and then, and he looked worn and nervous, and told me that his practice was growing too heavy for him, though he wouldn't take an assistant on any account. Years went on. And his son was killed in South Africa, and after that he began to be queer. There was something about him not like other people. I believe he kept his senses in his profession to the end. There was no complaint of his having made bad mistakes in cases, or anything of that sort, but he had a look about him. Luke was a red-headed man with a pale face when he was young, and he was never stout. In middle age he turned a sandy grey, and after his son died he grew thinner and thinner, till his head looked like a skull with parchment stretched over it very tight, and his eyes had a sort of glare in them that was very disagreeable to look at. He had an old dog that poor Mrs. Pratt had been fond of, and that used to follow her everywhere. He was a bulldog, and the sweetest tempered beast you ever saw, though he had a way of hitching his upper lip behind one of his fangs that frightened strangers a good deal. Sometimes, of an evening, Pratt and Bumble, that was the dog's name, used to sit and look at each other a long time, thinking about old times, I suppose, when Luke's wife used to sit in that chair you've got. That was always her place. And this was the doctor's, where I'm sitting. Bumble used to climb up by the footstool. He was old and fat by that time, and could not jump much, and his teeth were getting shaky. He would look steadily at Luke, and Luke looked steadily at the dog, his face growing more and more like a skull with two little coals for eyes, and after about 5 minutes or so, though it may have been less, old Bumble would suddenly begin to shake all over. And all on a sudden he would set up an awful howl, as if he had been shot, and tumble out of the easy chair and trot away, and hide himself under the sideboard, and lie there making odd noises. Considering Pratt's looks in those last months, the thing is not surprising, you know. I'm not nervous or imaginative, but I can quite believe he might have sent a sensitive woman into hysterics. His head looked so much like a skull in parchment. At last I came down one day before Christmas, when my ship was in dock and I had 3 weeks off. Bumble was not about, and I said casually that I supposed the old dog was dead. Yes, Pratt answered. And I thought there was something odd in his tone even before he went on after a little pause. I killed him, he said presently. I could not stand it any longer. I asked what it was that Luke could not stand, though I guessed well enough. He had a way of sitting in her chair and glaring at me, and then howling. Luke shivered a little. He didn't suffer at all, poor old Bumble, he went on in a hurry, as if he thought I might imagine he had been cruel. I put quinine into his drink to make him sleep soundly, and then I chloroformed him gradually, so that he could not have felt suffocated even if he was dreaming. It's been quieter since then. I wondered what he meant, for the words slipped out as if he could not help saying them. I've understood since. He meant that he did not hear that noise so often after the dog was out of the way. Perhaps he thought at first that it was old Bumble in the yard howling at the moon. Though it's not that kind of noise, is it? Besides, I know what it is, if Luke didn't. It's only a noise, after all, and a noise never hurt anybody yet. But he was much more imaginative than I am. No doubt there really is something about this place that I don't understand, but when I don't understand a thing, I call it a phenomenon, and I don't take it for granted that it's going to kill me, as he did. I don't understand everything, by long odds, nor do you, nor does any man who has been to sea. We used to talk of tidal waves, for instance, and we could not account for them. Now we account for them by calling them submarine earthquakes. And we branch off into 50 theories, any one of which might make earthquakes quite comprehensible if we only knew what they are. I fell in with one of them once, and the inkstand flew straight up from the table against the ceiling of my cabin. The same thing happened to Captain Lecky. I dare say you've read about it in his wrinkles. Very good. If that sort of thing took place ashore, in this room for instance, a nervous person would talk about spirits and levitation and 50 things that mean nothing, instead of just quietly setting it down as a phenomenon that has not been explained yet. My view of that voice, you see. Besides, what is there to prove that Luke killed his wife? I would not even suggest such a thing to anyone but you. After all, there was nothing but the coincidence that poor little Mrs. Pratt died suddenly in her bed a few days after I told that story at dinner. She was not the only woman who ever died like that. Luke got the doctor over from the next parish, and they agreed that she had died of something the matter with her heart. Why not? It's common enough. Of course, there was the ladle. I never told anybody about that. And it made me start when I found it in the cupboard in the bedroom. It was new, to a little tinned iron ladle that had not been in the fire more than once or twice, and there was some lead in it that had been melted and stuck to the bottom of the bowl, all grey, with hardened dross on it. But that proves nothing. A country doctor is generally a handy man, who does everything for himself, and Luke may have had a dozen reasons for melting a little lead in a ladle. He was fond of sea fishing, for instance, and he may have cast a sinker for a night line. Perhaps it was a weight for the hall clock, or something like that. All the same, when I found it, I had a rather queer sensation, because it looked so much like the thing I had described when I told them the story. Do you understand? It affected me unpleasantly, and I threw it away. It's at the bottom of the sea a mile from the spit. And it will be jolly well rusted beyond recognizing if it's ever washed up by the tide. You see, Luke must have bought it in the village, years ago, for the man sells just such ladles still. I suppose they are used in cooking. In any case, There was no reason why an inquisitive housemaid should find such a thing lying about, with lead in it, and wonder what it was, and perhaps talk to the maid who heard me tell the story at dinner. For that girl married the plumber's son in the village, and may remember the whole thing. You understand me, don't you? Now that Luke Pratt is dead and gone, and lies buried beside his wife, with an honest man's tombstone at his head, I should not care to stir up anything that could hurt his memory. They are both dead, and their son, too. There was trouble enough about Luke's death, as it was. How? He was found dead on the beach one morning, and there was a coroner's inquest. There were marks on his throat, but he had not been robbed. The verdict was that he had come to his end by the hands or teeth of some person or animal unknown, for half the jury thought it might have been a big dog that had thrown him down and gripped his windpipe, though the skin of his throat was not broken. No one knew at what time he had gone out, nor where he had been. He was found lying on his back above high water mark, and an old cardboard bandbox that had belonged to his wife lay under his hand. Open. The lid had fallen off. He seemed to have been carrying home a skull in the box. Doctors are fond of collecting such things. It had rolled out and lay near his head, and it was a remarkably fine skull. Rather small, beautifully shaped and very white, with perfect teeth. That is to say, the upper jaw was perfect, but there was no lower one at all, when I first saw it. Yes, I found it here when I came. You see, it was very white and polished, like a thing meant to be kept under a glass case, and the people did not know where it came from, nor what to do with it, so they put it back into the bandbox and set it on the shelf of the cupboard in the best bedroom. And of course they showed it to me when I took possession. I was taken down to the beach, too, to be shown the place where Luke was found, and the old fisherman explained just how he was lying, and the skull beside him. The only point he could not explain was why the skull had rolled up the sloping sand toward Luke's head instead of rolling downhill to his feet. It did not seem odd to me at the time, but I have often thought of it since, for the place is rather steep. I'll take you there tomorrow if you like. I made a sort of cairn of stones there afterward, when he fell down, or was thrown down. Whichever happened, the bandbox struck the sand, and the lid came off, and the thing came out and ought to have rolled down. But it didn't. It was close to his head, almost touching it, and turned with the face toward it. I say it didn't strike me as odd when the man told me, but I could not help thinking about it afterward, again and again, till I saw a picture of it all when I closed my eyes, and then I began to ask myself why the plaguey thing had rolled up instead of down, and why it had stopped near Luke's head instead of anywhere else, a yard away, for instance. You naturally want to know what conclusion I reached, don't you? None that at all explained the rolling, at all events. But I got something else into my head. After a time, that made me feel downright uncomfortable. Oh, I don't mean as to anything supernatural. There may be ghosts, or there may not be. If there are, I'm not inclined to believe that they can hurt living people except by frightening them. And, for my part, I would rather face any shape of ghost than a fog in the channel when it's crowded. No. What bothered me was just a foolish idea, that's all, and I cannot tell how it began. nor what made it grow till it turned into a certainty. I was thinking about Luke and his poor wife one evening over my pipe and a dull book, when it occurred to me that the skull might possibly be hers. And I have never got rid of the thought since. You'll tell me there's no sense in it, no doubt, that Mrs. Pratt was buried like a Christian and is lying in the churchyard where they put her, and that it's perfectly monstrous to suppose her husband kept her skull in her old bandbox in his bedroom. All the same, in the face of reason, and common sense, and probability, I'm convinced that he did. Doctors do all sorts of queer things that would make men like you and me feel creepy. And those are just the things that don't seem probable, nor logical, nor sensible to us. Then, don't you see, if it really was her skull, poor woman, the only way of accounting for his having it is that he really killed her. And did it in that way, as the woman killed her husbands in the story, and that he was afraid there might be an examination some day which would betray him. You see, I told that too, and I believe it had really happened some 50 or 60 years ago. They dug up the 3 skulls, you know, and there was a small lump of lead rattling about in each one. That was what hanged the woman. Luke remembered that, I'm sure. I don't want to know what he did when he thought of it. My taste never ran in the direction of horrors, and I don't fancy you care for them either, do you? No. If you did, you might supply what is wanting to the story. It must have been rather grim. Eh? I wish I did not see the whole thing so distinctly, just as everything must have happened. He took it the night before she was buried, I'm sure, after the coffin had been shut, and when the servant girl was asleep. I would bet anything that when he'd got it, he put something under the sheet in its place, to fill up and look like it. What do you suppose he put there, under the sheet? I don't wonder you take me up on what I am saying. First I tell you that I don't want to know what happened, and that I hate to think about horrors, and then I describe the whole thing to you as if I had seen it. I'm quite sure that it was her work. Bag that he put there. I remember the bag very well, for she always used it of an evening. It was made of brown plush, and when it was stuffed full, it was about the size of you understand. Yes, there I am. At it again. You may laugh at me, but you don't live here alone, where it was done, and you didn't tell Luke the story about the melted lead. I'm not nervous, I tell you, but sometimes I begin to feel that I understand why some people are. I dwell on all this when I'm alone, and I dream of it, and when that thing screams, well, frankly, I don't like the noise any more than you do, though I should be used to it by this time. I ought not to be nervous. I've sailed in a haunted ship. There was a man in the top, and 2/3 of the crew died of the West Coast fever inside of 10 days after we anchored, but I was all right. Then and afterward. I have seen some ugly sights, too, just as you have, and all the rest of us. But nothing ever stuck in my head in the way this does. You see, I've tried to get rid of the thing. But it doesn't like that. It wants to be there in its place, in Mrs. Pratt's bandbox in the cupboard in the best bedroom. It's not happy anywhere else. How do I know that? Because I've tried it. You don't suppose that I've not tried, do you? As long as it's there, it only screams now and then, generally at this time of year, but if I put it out of the house it goes on all night, and no servant will stay here 24 hours. As it is, I've often been left alone and have been obliged to shift for myself for a fortnight at a time. No one from the village would ever pass a night under the roof now, and as for selling the place, or even letting it, that's out of the question. The old women say that if I stay here I shall come to a bad end myself, before long. I'm not afraid of that. You smile at the mere idea that anyone could take such nonsense seriously. Quite right. It's utterly blatant nonsense, I agree with you. Didn't I tell you that it's only a noise after all when you started and looked round as if you expected to see a ghost standing behind your chair? I may be all wrong about the skull, and I like to think that I am when I can. It may be just a fine specimen which Luke got somewhere long ago, and what rattles about inside when you shake it may be nothing but a pebble, or a bit of hard clay, or anything. Skulls that have lain long in the ground generally have something inside them that rattles, don't they? No, I've never tried to get it out. Whatever it is, I'm afraid it might be lead. Don't you see? And if it is, I don't want to know the fact, for I'd much rather not be sure. If it really is lead, I killed her, quite as much as if I had done the deed myself. Anybody must see that, I should think. As long as I don't know for certain, I have the consolation of saying that it's all utterly ridiculous nonsense, that Mrs. Pratt died a natural death, and that the beautiful skull belonged to Luke when he was a student in London. But if I were quite sure, I believe I should have to leave the house. Indeed I do, most certainly. As it is, I had to give up trying to sleep in the best bedroom where the cupboard is. You ask me why I don't throw it into the pond. Yes, but please don't call it a confounded bugbear. It doesn't like being called names. There. Lord, what a shriek. I told you so. You're quite pale, man. Fill up your pipe and draw your chair nearer to the fire. And take some more drink. Old Holland's never hurt anybody yet. I've seen a Dutchman in Java drink half a jug of Hulstkamp in a morning without turning a hair. I don't take much rum myself, because it doesn't agree with my rheumatism, but you are not rheumatic and it won't damage you. Besides, it's a very damp night outside. The wind is howling again, and it will soon be in the southwest. Do you hear how the windows rattle? The tide must have turned too, by the moaning. We should not have heard the thing again if you had not said that. I'm pretty sure we should not. Oh yes, if you choose to describe it as a coincidence. You are quite welcome, but I would rather that you should not call the thing names again, if you don't mind. It may be that the poor little woman hears, and perhaps it hurts her, don't you know? Ghost? No. You don't call anything a ghost that you can take in your hands, and look at in broad daylight, and that rattles when you shake it. Do you, now? But it's something that hears and understands, there's no doubt about that. I tried sleeping in the best bedroom when I first came to the house, just because it was the best and the most comfortable, but I had to give it up. It was their room, and there's the big bed she died in. And the cupboard is in the thickness of the wall, near the head, on the left. That's where it likes to be kept, in its bandbox. I only used the room for a fortnight after I came, and then I turned out and took the little room downstairs, next to the surgery, where Luke used to sleep when he expected to be called to a patient during the night. I was always a good sleeper ashore. 8 hours is my dose, 11 to 7 when I'm alone, 12 to 8 when I have a friend with me. But I could not sleep after 3 o'clock in the morning in that room. A quarter past. To be accurate, as a matter of fact, I timed it with my old pocket chronometer, which still keeps good time, and it was always at exactly 17 minutes past 3. I wonder whether that was the hour when she died? It was not what you have heard. If it had been that, I could not have stood it 2 nights. It was just a start and a moan and hard breathing for a few seconds in the cupboard, and it could never have waked me under ordinary circumstances, I'm sure. I suppose you are like me in that, and we are just like other people who have been to sea. No natural sounds disturb us at all, not all the racket of a square rigger hove to in a heavy gale, or rolling on her beam ends before the wind. But if a lead pencil gets adrift and rattles in the drawer of your cabin table, you are awake in a moment. Just so you always understand. Very well, the noise in the cupboard was no louder than that, but it waked me instantly. I said it was like a start. I know what I mean, but it's hard to explain without seeming to talk nonsense. Of course, you cannot exactly hear a person start. At the most, you might hear the quick drawing of the breath between the parted lips and closed teeth, and the almost imperceptible sound of clothing that moved suddenly, though very slightly. It was like that. You know how one feels what a sailing vessel is going to do, 2 or 3 seconds before she does it, when one has the wheel. Writers say the same of a horse, but that's less strange, because the horse is a live animal with feelings of its own, and only poets and landsmen talk about a ship being alive, and all that. But I have always felt somehow that besides being a steaming machine or a sailing machine for carrying weights, a vessel at sea is a sensitive instrument, and a means of communication between nature and man, and most particularly the man at the wheel, if she is steered by hand. She takes her impressions directly from wind and sea, tide and stream, and transmits them to the man's hand, just as the wireless telegraph picks up the interrupted currents aloft and turns them out below in the form of a message. You see what I am driving at. I felt that something started in the cupboard, and I felt it so vividly that I heard it, though there may have been nothing to hear, and the sound inside my head waked me suddenly. But I really heard the other noise. It was as if it were muffled inside a box, as far away as if it came through a long-distance telephone, and yet I knew that it was inside the cupboard near the head of my bed. My hair did not bristle, and my blood did not run cold that time. I simply resented being waked up by something that had no business to make a noise, any more than a pencil should rattle in the drawer of my cabin table on board ship. For I did not understand. I just supposed that the cupboard had some communication with the outside air, and that the wind had got in and was moaning through it with a sort of very faint screech. I struck a light and looked at my watch, and it was 17 minutes past 3. Then I turned over and went to sleep on my right ear. That's my good one. I'm pretty deaf with the other, for I struck the water with it when I was a lad and diving from the foretopsail yard. Silly thing to do, it was, but the result is very convenient when I want to go to sleep when there. Essay noise. That was the first night, and the same thing happened again and several times afterward, but not regularly, though it was always at the same time, to a second. Perhaps I was sometimes sleeping on my good ear. And sometimes not. I overhauled the cupboard and there was no way by which the wind could get in, or anything else, for the door makes a good fit, having been meant to keep out moths, I suppose. Mrs. Pratt must have kept her winter things in it, for it still smells of camphor and turpentine. After about a fortnight I had had enough of the noises. So far, I had said to myself that it would be silly to yield to it and take the skull out of the room. Things always look differently by daylight, don't they? But the voice grew louder. I suppose one may call it a voice, and it got inside my deaf ear, too, one night. I realized that when I was wide awake, for my good ear was jammed down on the pillow. And I ought not to have heard a foghorn in that position. But I heard that, and it made me lose my temper, unless it scared me, for sometimes the two are not far apart. I struck a light and got up. And I opened the cupboard, grabbed the bandbox and threw it out of the window, as far as I could. Then my hair stood on end. The thing screamed in the air, like a shell from a 12-inch gun. It fell on the other side of the road. The night was very dark, and I could not see it fall, but I know it fell beyond the road. The window is just over the front door. It's 15 yards to the fence, more or less, and the road is 10 yards wide. There's a quickset hedge beyond, along the glebe that belongs to the vicarage. I did not sleep much more that night. It was not more than half an hour after I had thrown the bandbox out when I heard a shriek outside. Like what we've had tonight, but worse, more despairing, I should call it, and it may have been my imagination, but I could have sworn that the screams came nearer and nearer each time. I lit a pipe, and walked up and down for a bit. And then took a book and sat up reading, but I'll be hanged if I can remember what I read, nor even what the book was, for every now and then a shriek came up that would have made a dead man turn in his coffin. A little before dawn, someone knocked at the front door. There was no mistaking that for anything else, and I opened my window and looked down, for I guessed that someone wanted the doctor, supposing that the new man had taken Luke's house. It was rather a relief to hear a human knock after that awful noise. You cannot see the door from above, owing to the little porch. The knocking came again, and I called out, asking who was there. But nobody answered, though the knock was repeated. I sang out again, and said that the doctor did not live here any longer. There was no answer, but it occurred to me that it might be some old countryman who was stone deaf. So I took my candle and went down to open the door. Upon my word, I was not thinking of the thing yet, and I had almost forgotten the other noises. I went down convinced that I should find somebody outside. On the doorstep, with a message. I set the candle on the hall table, so that the wind should not blow it out when I opened. While I was drawing the old-fashioned bolt, I heard the knocking again. It was not loud, and it had a queer, hollow sound. Now that I was close to it, I remember, but I certainly thought it was made by some person who wanted to get in. It wasn't. There was nobody there, but as I opened the door inward, Standing a little on one side, so as to see out at once, something rolled across the threshold and stopped against my foot. I drew back as I felt it, for I knew what it was before I looked down. I cannot tell you how I knew, and it seemed unreasonable, for I am still quite sure that I had thrown it across the road. It's a French window that opens wide, and I got a good swing when I flung it out. Besides, when I went out early in the morning, I found the bandbox beyond the thick-set hedge. You may think it opened when I threw it, and that the skull dropped out, but that's impossible, for nobody could throw an empty cardboard box so far. It's out of the question. You might as well try to fling a ball of paper 25 yards, or a blown bird's egg. To go back, I shut and bolted the hall door, picked the thing up carefully, and put it on the table beside the candle. I did that mechanically, as one instinctively does the right thing in danger without thinking at all unless one does the opposite. It may seem odd, but I believe my first thought had been that somebody might come and find me there on the threshold while it was resting against my foot. Lying a little on its side, and turning one hollow eye up at my face, as if it meant to accuse me. And the light and shadow from the candle played in the hollows of the eyes as it stood on the table, so that they seemed to open and shut at me. Then the candle went out, quite unexpectedly, though the door was fastened and there was not the least draught, and I used up at least half a dozen matches, before it would burn again. I sat down rather suddenly, without quite knowing why. Probably I had been badly frightened, and perhaps you will admit there was no great shame in being scared. The thing had come home, and it wanted to go upstairs. Back to its cupboard. I sat still and stared at it for a bit, till I began to feel very cold. Then I took it and carried it up and set it in its place, and I remember that I spoke to it, and promised that it should have its bandbox again in the morning. You want to know whether I stayed in the room till daybreak? Yes, but I kept a light burning, and sat up smoking and reading, most likely out of fright. Plain, undeniable fear, and you need not call it cowardice either, for that's not the same thing. I could not have stayed alone with that thing in the cupboard. I should have been scared to death, though I am not more timid than other people. Confound it all, man, it had crossed the road alone, and had got up the doorstep and had knocked to be let in. When the dawn came, I put on my boots and went out to find the bandbox. I had to go a good way round, by the gate near the highroad, and I found the box open and hanging on the other side of the hedge. It had caught on the twigs by the string, and the lid had fallen off and was lying on the ground below it. That shows that it did not open till it was well over, and if it had not opened as soon as it left my hand, what was inside it must have gone beyond the road too. That's all. I took the box upstairs, to the cupboard, and put the skull back and locked it up. When the girl brought me my breakfast she said she was sorry, but that she must go, and she did not care if she lost her month's wages. I looked at her, and her face was a sort of greenish, yellowish white. I pretended to be surprised, and asked what was the matter, but that was of no use, for she just turned on me and wanted to know whether I meant to stay in a haunted house, and how long I expected to live if I did, for though she noticed I was sometimes a little hard of hearing, she did not believe that even I could sleep through those screams again, and if I could, why had I been moving about the house and opening and shutting the front door between 3 and 4 in the morning? There was no answering that, since she had heard me, so off she went, and I was left to myself. I went down to the village during the morning and found a woman who was willing to come and do the little work there is and cook my dinner, on condition that she might go home every night. As for me, I moved downstairs that day, and I have never tried to sleep in the best bedroom since. After a little while I got a brace of middle-aged Scotch servants from London, and things were quiet enough for a long time. I began by telling them that the house was in a very exposed position, and that the wind whistled round it a good deal in the autumn and winter, which had given it a bad name in the village, the Cornish people being inclined to superstition and telling ghost stories. The two hard-faced, sandy-haired sisters almost smiled, and they answered with great contempt that they had no great opinion of any southern bogey whatever, having been in service in 2 English haunted houses, where they had never seen so much as the boy in grey, whom they reckoned no very particular rarity in Forfarshire. They stayed with me several months, and while they were in the house we had peace and quiet. One of them is here again now, but she went away with her sister within the year. This one she was the cook married the sexton, who works in my garden. That's the way of it. It's a small village, and he has not much to do. And he knows enough about flowers to help me nicely, besides doing most of the hard work, for though I'm fond of exercise, I'm getting a little stiff in the hinges. He's a sober, silent sort of fellow, who minds his own business. And he was a widower when I came here. Treherne is his name, James Treherne. The Scotch sisters would not admit that there was anything wrong about the house, but when November came, they gave me warning that they were going, on the ground that the chapel was such a long walk from here, being in the next parish, and that they could not possibly go to our church. But the younger one came back in the spring, and as soon as the banns could be published she was married to James Treherne by the vicar. And she seems to have had no scruples about hearing him preach since then. I'm quite satisfied if she is. The couple live in a small cottage that looks over the churchyard. I suppose you are wondering what all this has to do with what I was talking about. I'm alone so much that when an old friend comes to see me, I sometimes go on talking just for the sake of hearing my own voice. But in this case, there is really a connection of ideas. It was James Treherne who buried poor Mrs. Pratt, and her husband after her in the same grave, and it's not far from the back of his cottage. That's the connection in my mind, you see. It's plain enough. He knows something, I'm quite sure that he does. By his manner, though he's such a reticent beggar. Yes, I'm alone in the house at night now, for Mrs. Treherne does everything herself, and when I have a friend the sexton's niece comes in to wait on the table. He takes his wife home every evening in winter, but in summer, when there's light, she goes by herself. She's not a nervous woman, but she's less sure than she used to be that there are no bogies in England worth a Scotchwoman's notice. Isn't it amusing, the idea that Scotland has a monopoly of the supernatural? Odd sort of national pride, I call that, don't you? That's a good fire, isn't it? When driftwood gets started at last, there's nothing like it. I think. Yes, we get lots of it, for I'm sorry to say there are still a great many wrecks about here. It's a lonely coast, and you may have all the wood you want for the trouble of bringing it in. Traherne and I borrow a cart now and then, and load it between here and the spit. I hate a coal fire when I can get wood of any sort. A log is company, even if it's only a piece of a deck. Beam or timber sawn off, and the salt in it makes pretty sparks. See how they fly, like Japanese hand fireworks. Upon my word, with an old friend and a good fire and a pipe, one forgets all about that thing upstairs. Especially now that the wind has moderated. It's only a lull, though, and it will blow a gale before morning. You think you would like to see the skull? I've no objection. There's no reason why you shouldn't have a look at it. And you never saw a more perfect one in your life, except that there are 2 front teeth missing in the lower jaw. Oh yes, I had not told you about the jaw yet. Traherne found it in the garden last spring when he was digging a pit for a new asparagus bed. You know we make asparagus beds 6 or 8 feet deep here. Yes, I had forgotten to tell you that. He was digging straight down, just as he digs a grave, if you want a good asparagus bed made. I advise you to get a sexton to make it for you. Those fellows have a wonderful knack at that sort of digging. Traherne had got down about 3 feet when he cut into a mass of white lime in the side of the trench. He had noticed that the earth was a little looser there, though he says it had not been disturbed for a number of years. I suppose he thought that even old lime might not be good for asparagus, so he broke it out and threw it up. It was pretty hard, he says, in biggyish lumps, and out of sheer force of habit he cracked the lumps with his spade as they lay outside the pit beside him. The jawbone of a skull dropped out of one of the pieces. He thinks he must have knocked out the 2 front teeth in breaking up the lime, but he did not see them anywhere. He's a very experienced man in such things, as you may imagine, and he said at once that the jaw had probably belonged to a young woman, and that the teeth had been complete when she died. He brought it to me, and asked me if I wanted to keep it. If I did not, he said he would drop it into the next grave he made in the churchyard, as he supposed it was a Christian jaw, and ought to have decent burial, wherever the rest of the body might be. I told him that doctors often put bones into quicklime to whiten them nicely, and that I supposed Dr. Pratt had once had a little lime pit in the garden for that purpose, and had forgotten the jaw. Traherne looked at me quietly. Maybe it fitted that skull that used to be in the cupboard upstairs, sir, he said. Maybe Dr. Pratt had put the skull into the lime to clean it, or something, and when he took it out, he left the lower jaw behind. There's some human hair sticking in the lime, sir. I saw there was. And that was what Traherne said. If he did not suspect something, why in the world should he have suggested that the jaw might fit the skull? Besides, it did. That's proof that he knows more than he cares to tell. Do you suppose he looked before she was buried? Or perhaps when he buried Luke in the same grave? Well, it's of no use to go over that, is it? I said I would keep the jaw with the skull. And I took it upstairs, and fitted it into its place. There's not the slightest doubt about the 2 belonging together, and together they are. Traherne knows several things. We were talking about plastering the kitchen a while ago, and he happened to remember that it had not been done since the very week when Mrs. Pratt died. He did not say that the mason must have left some lime on the place, but he thought it, and that it was the very same lime he had found in the asparagus pit. He knows a lot. Traherne is one of your silent beggars who can put two and two together. That grave is very near the back of his cottage, too, and he's one of the quickest men with a spade I ever saw. If he wanted to know the truth, he could, and no one else would ever be the wiser unless he chose to tell. In a quiet village like ours, people don't go and spend the night in the churchyard to see whether the sexton potters about by himself between 10:00 and daylight. What is awful to think of is Luke's deliberation, if he did it, his cool certainty that no one would find him out, above all, his nerve, for that must have been extraordinary. I sometimes think it's bad enough to live in the place where it was done, if it really was done. I always put in the condition, you see, for the sake of his memory, and a little bit for my own sake, too. I'll go upstairs and fetch the box in a minute. Let me light my pipe, there's no hurry. We had supper early, and it's only 9:30. I never let a friend go to bed before 12, or with less than 3 glasses. You may have as many more as you like, but you shan't have less, for the sake of old times. It's breezing up again, do you hear? That was only a lull just now, and we are going to have a bad night. A thing happened that made me start a little when I found that the jaw fitted exactly. I'm not very easily startled in that way myself, but I have seen people make a quick movement, drawing their breath sharply, when they had thought they were alone and suddenly turned and saw someone very near them. Nobody can call that fear. You wouldn't, would you? No. Well, just when I had set the jaw in its place under the skull, the teeth closed sharply on my finger. It felt exactly as if it were biting me hard, and I confess that I jumped before I realized that I had been pressing the jaw and the skull together with my other hand. I assure you I was not at all nervous. It was broad daylight, too, and a fine day, and the sun was streaming into the best bedroom. It would have been absurd to be nervous, and it was only a quick mistaken impression. But it really made me feel queer. Somehow it made me think of the funny verdict of the coroner's jury on Luke's death, by the hand or teeth of some person or animal unknown. Ever since that I've wished I had seen those marks on his throat, though the lower jaw was missing then. I have often seen a man do insane things with his hands that he does not realize at all. I once saw a man hanging on by an old awning stop with one hand, leaning backward, outboard, with all his weight on it, and he was just cutting the stop with the knife in his other hand when I got my arms round him. We were in mid-ocean, going 20 knots. He had not the smallest idea what he was doing. Neither had I when I managed to pinch my finger between the teeth of that thing. I can feel it now. It was exactly as if it were alive and were trying to bite me. It would if it could. For I know it hates me, poor thing. Do you suppose that what rattles about inside is really a bit of lead? Well, I'll get the box down presently, and if whatever it is happens to drop out into your hands that's your affair. If it's only a clod of earth or a pebble, the whole matter would be off my mind, and I don't believe I should ever think of the skull again, but somehow I cannot bring myself to shake out the bit of hard stuff myself. The mere idea that it may be lead makes me confoundedly uncomfortable, yet I've got the conviction that I shall know before long. I shall certainly know. I'm sure Traherne knows, but he's such a silent beggar. I'll go upstairs now and get it. What? You had better go with me? Ha, ha. Do you think I'm afraid of a bandbox and a noise? Nonsense. Bother the candle, it won't light. As if the ridiculous thing understood what it's wanted for. Look at that. The third match. They light fast enough for my pipe. There, do you see? It's a fresh box, just out of the tin safe, where I keep the supply on account of the dampness. Oh, you think the wick of the candle may be damp? Do you? All right, I'll light the beastly thing in the fire. That won't go out, at all events. Yes, it sputters a bit, but it will keep lighted now. It burns just like any other candle, doesn't it? The fact is, candles are not very good about here. I don't know where they come from, but they have a way of burning low occasionally, with a greenish flame that spits tiny sparks, and I'm often annoyed by their going out of themselves. It cannot be helped, for it will be long before we have electricity in our village. It really is rather a poor light, isn't it? You think I had better leave you the candle and take the lamp, do you? I don't like to carry lamps about, that's the truth. I never dropped one in my life, but I have always thought I might, and it's so confoundedly dangerous if you do. Besides, I am pretty well used to these rotten candles, by this time. You may as well finish that glass while I'm getting it, for I don't mean to let you off with less than 3 before you go to bed. You won't have to go upstairs either, for I've put you in the old study next to the surgery. That's where I live myself. The fact is, I never ask a friend to sleep upstairs now. The last man who did was Krakenthorpe, and he said he was kept awake all night. You remember old Crack, don't you? He stuck to the service. And they'd just made him an admiral. Yes, I'm off now unless the candle goes out. I couldn't help asking if you remembered Krakenthorpe. If anyone had told us that the skinny little idiot he used to be was to turn out the most successful of the lot of us, we should have laughed at the idea, shouldn't we? You and I did not do badly, it's true, but I'm really going now. I don't mean to let you think that I've been putting it off by talking. As if there were anything to be afraid of. If I were scared, I should tell you so quite frankly, and get you to go upstairs with me, *********************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************** I brought it down very carefully, so as not to disturb it, poor thing. You see, if it were shaken, the jaw might get separated from it again, and I'm sure it wouldn't like that. Yes, the candle went out as I was coming downstairs, but that was the draft from the leaky window on the landing. Did you hear anything? Yes, there was another scream. Am I pale, do you say? That's nothing. My heart is a little queer sometimes, and I went upstairs too fast. In fact, that's one reason why I really prefer to live altogether on the ground floor. Wherever that shriek came from, it was not from the skull, for I had the box in my hand when I heard the noise, and here it is now. So we have proved definitely that the screams are produced by something else. I've no doubt I shall find out some day what makes them. Some crevice in the wall, of course, or a crack in a chimney, or a chink in the frame of a window. That's the way all ghost stories end in real life. Do you know, I'm jolly glad I thought of going up and bringing it down for you to see, for that last shriek settles the question. To think that I should have been so weak as to fancy that the poor skull could really cry out like a living thing. Now I'll open the box, and we'll take it out and look at it under the bright light. It's rather awful to think that the poor lady used to sit there, in your chair, evening after evening, in just the same light. Isn't it? But then I've made up my mind that it's all rubbish from beginning to end, and that it's just an old skull that Luke had when he was a student, and perhaps he put it into the lime merely to whiten it, and could not find the jaw. I made a seal on the string, you see, after I had put the jaw in its place, and I wrote on the cover. There's the old white label on it still, from the milliner. S. Addressed to Mrs. Pratt when the hat was sent to her, and as there was room I wrote on the edge, a skull, once the property of the late Luke Pratt, M.D. I don't quite know why I wrote that. Unless it was with the idea of explaining how the thing happened to be in my possession. I cannot help wondering sometimes what sort of hat it was that came in the bandbox. What color was it, do you think? Was it a gay spring hat with a bobbing feather and pretty ribbons? Strange that the very same box should hold the head that wore the finery perhaps. No, we made up our minds that it just came from the hospital in London where Luke did his time. It's far better to look at it in that light, isn't it? There's no more connection between that skull and poor Mrs. Pratt than there was between my story about the lead and, good Lord, take the lamp, don't let it go out. If you can help it, I'll have the window fastened again in a second. I say, what a gale. There, it's out. I told you so. Never mind, there's the firelight. I've got the window shut. The bolt was only half down. Was the box blown off the table? Where the deuce is it? There. That won't open again, for I've put up the bar. Good dodge, an old-fashioned bar. There's nothing like it. Now, you find the bandbox while I light the lamp. Confound those wretched matches. Yes. A pipe spill is better. It must light in the fire. I hadn't thought of it. Thank you. There we are again. Now, where's the box? Yes, put it back on the table, and we'll open it. That's the first time I have ever known the wind to burst that window open. But it was partly carelessness on my part when I last shut it. Yes, of course I heard the scream. It seemed to go all round the house before it broke in at the window. That proves that it's always been the wind and nothing else, doesn't it? When it was not the wind, it was my imagination. I've always been a very imaginative man. I must have been, though I did not know it. As we grow older, we understand ourselves better. Don't you know? I'll have a drop of the Hulstkamp neat, by way of an exception, since you are filling up your glass. That damp gust chilled me, and with my rheumatic tendency, I'm very much afraid of a chill. For the cold sometimes seems to stick in my joints all winter when it once gets in. By George, that's good stuff. I'll just light a fresh pipe, now that everything is snug again, and then we'll open the box. I'm so glad we heard that last scream together, with the skull here on the table between us, for a thing cannot possibly be in two places at the same time, and the noise most certainly came from outside. As any noise the wind makes must. You thought you heard it scream through the room after the window was burst open? Oh yes, so did I, but that was natural enough when everything was open. Of course we heard the wind. What could one expect? Look here, please. I want you to see that the seal is intact, before we open the box together. Will you take my glasses? No, you have your own. All right. The seal is sound. You see, and you can read the words of the motto easily. Sweet and low, that's it, because the poem goes on wind of the western sea, and says, blow him again to me, and all that. Here is the seal on my watch chain, where it's hung for more than 40 years. My poor little wife gave it to me when I was courting, and I never had any other. It was just like her to think of those words. She was always fond of Tennyson. It's of no use to cut the string, for it's fastened to the box, so I'll just break the wax and untie the knot, and afterward we'll seal it up again. You see, I like to feel that the thing is safe in its place, and that nobody can take it out. Not that I should suspect Traherne of meddling with it, but I always feel that he knows a lot more than he tells. You see, I've managed it without breaking the string. Though when I fastened it, I never expected to open the bandbox again. The lid comes off easily enough. There. Now look. What? Nothing in it? Empty? It's gone, man, the skull is gone. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. No, there's nothing the matter with me. I'm only trying to collect my thoughts. It's so strange. I'm positively certain that it was inside when I put on the seal last spring. I can't have imagined that. It's utterly impossible. If I ever took a stiff glass with a friend now and then, I would admit that I might have made some idiotic mistake when I had taken too much. But I don't, and I never did. A pint of ale at supper and half a go of rum at bedtime was the most I ever took in my good days. I believe it's always we sober fellows who get rheumatism and gout. Yet there was my seal, and there is the empty bandbox. That's plain enough. I say, I don't half like this. It's not right. There's something wrong about it. In my opinion. You needn't talk to me about supernatural manifestations, for I don't believe in them, not a little bit. Somebody must have tampered with the seal and stolen the skull. Sometimes, when I go out to work in the garden in summer, I leave my watch and chain on the table. Traherne must have taken the seal then, and used it, for he would be quite sure that I should not come in for at least an hour. If it was not Traherne. Oh, don't talk to me about the possibility that the thing has got out by itself. If it has, it must be somewhere about the house, in some out-of-the-way corner, waiting. We may come upon it anywhere, waiting for us. Don't you know, just waiting in the dark. Then it will scream at me, it will shriek at me in the dark, for it hates me, I tell you. The bandbox is quite empty. We are not dreaming, either of us. There, I turn it upside down. What's that? Something fell out as I turned it over. It's on the floor, it's near your feet, I know it is, and we must find it. Help me to find it, man. Have you got it? For God's sake, give it to me, quickly. Lead. I knew it when I heard it fall. I knew it couldn't be anything else by the little thud it made on the hearthrug. So it was lead after all. And Luke did it. I feel a little bit shaken up, not exactly nervous, you know, but badly shaken up, that's the fact. Anybody would, I should think. After all, you cannot say that it's fear of the thing, for I went up and brought it down. At least, I believed I was bringing it down, and that's the same thing, and by George, rather than give in to such silly nonsense, I'll take the box upstairs again and put it back in its place. It's not that. It's the certainty that the poor little woman came to her end in that way, by my fault, because I told the story. That's what is so dreadful. Somehow, I had always hoped that I should never be quite sure of it. But there is no doubting it now. Look at that. Look at it. That little lump of lead with no particular shape. Think of what it did, man. Doesn't it make you shiver? He gave her something to make her sleep. Of course, but there must have been one moment of awful agony. Think of having boiling lead poured into your brain. Think of it. She was dead before she could scream, but only think of there it is again. It's just outside, I know it's just outside, I can't keep it out of my head, asterisk 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 asterisk, you thought I had fainted? No, I wish I had, for it would have stopped sooner. It's all very well to say that it's only a noise. And that a noise never hurt anybody, you re as white as a shroud yourself. There's only one thing to be done, if we hope to close an eye tonight. We must find it and put it back into its bandbox, and shut it up in the cupboard, where it likes to be. I don't know how it got out, but it wants to get in again. That's why it screams so awfully tonight. It was never so bad as this, never since I first bury it. Yes, if we can find it. We'll bury it, if it takes us all night. We'll bury it 6 feet deep and ram down the earth over it, so that it shall never get out again, and if it screams, we shall hardly hear it, so deep down. Quick, we'll get the lantern and look for it. It cannot be far away, I'm sure it's just outside. It was coming in when I shut the window, I know it. Yes, you're quite right. I'm losing my senses, and I must get hold of myself. Don't speak to me for a minute or two. I'll sit quite still and keep my eyes shut and repeat something I know. That's the best way. Add together the altitude, the latitude, and the polar distance, divide by 2 and subtract the altitude from the half. Sum, then add the logarithm of the secant of the latitude, the cosecant of the polar distance, the cosine of the half sum, and the sine of the half sum minus the altitude there. Don't say that I'm out of my senses, for my memory is all right. Isn't it? Of course, you may say that it's mechanical, and that we never forget the things we learned when we were boys, and have used almost every day for a lifetime. But that's the very point. When a man is going crazy, It's the mechanical part of his mind that gets out of order and won't work right. He remembers things that never happened, or he sees things that aren't real, or he hears noises when there is perfect silence. That's not what is the matter with either of us, is it? Come, we'll get the lantern and go round the house. It's not raining only, blowing like old boots, as we used to say. The lantern is in the cupboard under the stairs in the hall. And I always keep it trimmed in case of a wreck. No use to look for the thing? I don't see how you can say that. It was nonsense to talk of burying it, of course, for it doesn't want to be buried. It wants to go back into its bandbox and be taken upstairs, poor thing. Traherne took it out, I know, and made the seal over again. Perhaps he took it to the churchyard, and he may have meant well. I dare say he thought that it would not scream any more if it were quietly laid in consecrated ground, near where it belongs. But it has come home. Yes, that's it. He's not half a bad fellow, Traherne, and rather religiously inclined, I think. Does not that sound natural, and reasonable, and well meant? He supposed it screamed because it was not decently buried with the rest. But he was wrong. How should he know that it screams at me, because it hates me? And because it's my fault that there was that little lump of lead in it? No use to look for it, anyhow? Nonsense. I tell you it wants to be found. Hark. What's that knocking? Do you hear it? Knock. Knock, knock 3 times, then a pause, and then again. It has a hollow sound, hasn't it? It has come home. I've heard that knock before. It wants to come in and be taken upstairs, in its box. It's at the front door. Will you come with me? We'll take it in. Yes, I own that I don't like to go alone and open the door. The thing will roll in and stop against my foot, just as it did before, and the light will go out. I'm a good deal shaken by finding that bit of lead, and, besides, my heart isn't quite right. Too much strong tobacco, perhaps. Besides, I'm quite willing to own that I'm a bit nervous tonight, if I never was before in my life. That's right, come along. I'll take the box with me, so as not to come back. Do you hear the knocking? It's not like any other knocking I ever heard. If you will hold this door open, I can find the lantern under the stairs by the light from this room, without bringing the lamp into the hall. It would only go out. The thing knows we are coming. Hark. It's impatient to get in. Don't shut the door till the lantern is ready, whatever you do. There will be the usual trouble with the matches, I suppose. No, the first one. By Jove. I tell you it wants to get in, so there's no trouble. All right with that door now, shut it, please. Now come and hold the lantern, for it's blowing so hard outside that I shall have to use both hands. That's it, hold the light low. Do you hear the knocking still? Here goes. I'll open just enough with my foot against the bottom of the door now. Catch it. It's only the wind that blows it across the floor, that's all. There's half a hurricane outside, I tell you. Have you got it? The bandbox is on the table. 1 minute, and I'll have the bar up. There. Why did you throw it into the box so roughly? It doesn't. Tea like that, you know. What do you say? Bitten your hand? Nonsense, man. You did just what I did. You pressed the jaws together with your other hand and pinched yourself. Let me see. You don't mean to say you have drawn blood? You must have squeezed hard, by Jove, for the skin is certainly torn. I'll give you some carbolic solution for it before we go to bed, for they say a scratch from a skull's tooth may go bad and give trouble. Come inside again and let me see it by the lamp. I'll bring the bandbox, never mind the lantern, it may just as well burn in the hall, for I shall need it presently when I go up the stairs. Yes, shut the door if you will, it makes it more cheerful and bright. Is your finger still bleeding? I'll get you the carbolic in an instant, just let me see the thing. Ugh! There's a drop of blood on the upper jaw. It's on the eye tooth. Ghastly, isn't it? When I saw it running along the floor of the hall, the strength almost went out of my hands, and I felt my knees bending. Then I understood that it was the gale, driving it over the smooth boards. You don't blame me? No, I should think not. We were boys together, and we've seen a thing or two, and we may just as well own to each other that we were both in a beastly funk when it slid across the floor at you. No wonder you pinched your finger picking it up. After that, if I did the same thing out of sheer nervousness, in broad daylight, with the sun streaming in on me. Strange that the jaw should stick to it so closely. Isn't it? I suppose it's the dampness, for it shuts like a vice. I have wiped off the drop of blood, for it was not nice to look at. I'm not going to try to open the jaws, don't be afraid. I shall not play any tricks with the poor thing, but I'll just seal the box again, and we'll take it upstairs and put it away where it wants to be. The wax is on the writing table, by the window. Thank you. It will be long before I leave my seal lying about again, for Traherne to use, I can tell you. Explain? I don't explain natural phenomena, but if you choose to think that Traherne had hidden it somewhere in the bushes, and that the gale blew it to the house against the door, and made it knock, as if it wanted to be let in, you're not thinking the impossible, and I'm quite ready to agree with you. Do you see that? You can swear that you've actually seen me seal it this time, in case anything of the kind should occur again. The wax fastens the strings to the lid, which cannot possibly be lifted, even enough to get in one finger. You're quite satisfied, aren't you? Yes. Besides, I shall lock the cupboard and keep the key in my pocket hereafter. Now we can take the lantern and go upstairs. Do you know? I'm very much inclined to agree with your theory that the wind blew it against the house. I'll go ahead, for I know the stairs. Just hold the lantern near my feet as we go up. How the wind howls and whistles! Did you feel the sand on the floor under your shoes as we crossed the hall? Yes, this is the door of the best bedroom. Hold up the lantern, please. This side, by the head of the bed. I left the cupboard open when I got the box. Isn't it queer how the faint odor of women's dresses will hang about an old closet for years? This is the shelf. You've seen me set the box there, and now you see me turn the key and put it into my pocket. So that's done, Asterisk. Good night. Are you sure you re quite comfortable? It's not much of a room, but I dare say you would as soon sleep here as upstairs, tonight. If you want anything, sing out, there's only a laugh and plaster partition between us. There's not so much wind on this side by half. There's the Hollands on the table, if you'll have one more nightcap. No? Well, do as you please. Good night again, and don't dream about that thing, if you can. The following paragraph appeared in the _Penraden News November 23, 1906. Mysterious death of a retired SEA captain. The village of Treadcombe is much disturbed by the strange death of Captain Charles Braddock, and all sorts of impossible stories are circulating with regard to the circumstances, which certainly seem difficult of explanation. The retired captain, who had successfully commanded in his time the largest and fastest liners belonging to one of the principal transatlantic steamship companies, was found dead in his bed on Tuesday morning in his own cottage, a quarter of a mile from the village. An examination was made at once by the local practitioner, which revealed the horrible fact that the deceased had been bitten in the throat by a human assailant, with such amazing force as to crush the windpipe and cause death. The marks of the teeth of both jaws were so plainly visible on the skin that they could be counted, but the perpetrator of the deed had evidently lost the two lower middle incisors. It is hoped that this peculiarity may help to identify the murderer, who can only be a dangerous escaped maniac. The deceased, though over 65 years of age, is said to have been a hale man of considerable physical strength, and it is remarkable that no signs of any struggle were visible in the room. Nor could it be ascertained how the murderer had entered the house. Warning has been sent to all the insane asylums in the United Kingdom, but as yet no information has been received regarding the escape of any dangerous patient. The coroner's jury returned the somewhat singular verdict that Captain Braddock came to his death by the hands or teeth of some person unknown. The local surgeon is said to have expressed privately the opinion that the maniac is a woman, a view he deduces from the small size of the jaws, as shown by the marks of the teeth. The whole affair is shrouded in mystery. Captain Braddock was a widower, and lived alone. He leaves no children. _note_. Students of ghost lore and haunted houses will find the foundation of the foregoing story in the legends about a skull which is still preserved in the farmhouse called Bettiscombe Manor, situated, I believe, on the Dorsetshire coast. Man overboard. Yes, I have heard man overboard a good many times since I was a boy, and once or twice I have seen the man go. There are more men lost in that way than passengers on ocean steamers ever learn of. I have stood looking over the rail on a dark night, when there was a step beside me, and something flew past my head like a big black bat, and then there was a splash. Stokers often go like that. They go mad with the heat, and they slip up on deck and are gone before anybody can stop them, often without being seen or heard. Now and then a passenger will do it, but he generally has what he thinks a pretty good reason. I have seen a man empty his revolver into a crowd of emigrants forward, and then go over like a rocket. Of course, any officer who respects himself will do what he can to pick a man up, if the weather is not so heavy that he would have to risk his ship. But I don't think I remember seeing a man come back when he was once fairly gone more than 2 or 3 times in all my life, though we have often picked up the life buoy, and sometimes the fellow's cap. Stokers and passengers jump over. I never knew a sailor to do that, drunk or sober. Yes, they say it has happened on hard ships, but I never knew a case myself. Once in a long time a man is fished out when it is just too late, and dies in the boat before you can get him aboard, and well, I don't know that I ever told that story since it happened. I knew a fellow who went over, and came back dead. I didn't see him after he came back. Only one of us did, but we all knew he was there. No, I am not giving you sharks. There isn't a shark in this story, and I don't know that I would tell it at all if we were in tea alone, just you and I. But you and I have seen things in various parts, and maybe you will understand. Anyhow, you know that I am telling what I know about, and nothing else, and it has been on my mind to tell you ever since it happened. Only there hasn't been a chance. It's a long story, and it took some time to happen, and it began a good many years ago, in October, as well as I can remember. I was mate then. I passed the local Marine Board for master about 3 years later. She was the Helen B. Jackson of New York, with lumber for the West Indies, 4-masted schooner, Captain Hackstaff. She was an old-fashioned one, even then no steam donkey, and all to do by hand. There were still sailors in the coasting trade in those days. You remember. She wasn't a hard ship, for the old man was better than most of them, though he kept to himself and had a face like a monkey wrench. We were 13, all told, in the ship's company, and some of them afterwards thought that might have had something to do with it. But I had all that nonsense knocked out of me when I was a boy. I don't mean to say that I liked to go to sea on a Friday, but I have gone to sea on a Friday, and nothing has happened. And twice before that we have been 13, because one of the hands didn't turn up at the last minute, and nothing ever happened either, nothing worse than the loss of a light spar or 2, or a little canvas. Whenever I have been wrecked, we had sailed as cheerily as you please, no 13s, no Fridays, no dead men in the hold. I believe it generally happens that way. I dare say you remember those 2 Benton boys that were so much alike? It is no wonder, for they were twin brothers. They shipped with us as boys on the old Boston Belle when you were mate and I was before the mast. I never was quite sure which was which of those 2. Even then, and when they both had beards, it was harder than ever to tell them apart. One was Jim, and the other was Jack, James Benton and John Benton. The only difference I ever could see was that one seemed to be rather more cheerful and inclined to talk than the other. But one couldn't even be sure of that. Perhaps they had moods. Anyhow, there was one of them that used to whistle when he was alone. He only knew one tune, and that was Nancy Lee, and the other didn't know any tune at all, but I may be mistaken about that, too. Perhaps they both knew it. Well, those 2 Benton boys turned up on board the Helen B. Jackson They had been on half a dozen ships since the Boston Belle and they had grown up and were good seamen. They had reddish beards and bright blue eyes and freckled faces, and they were quiet fellows, good workmen on rigging, pretty willing, and both good men at the wheel. They managed to be in the same watch. It was the port watch on the _Helen B_, and that was mine, and I had great confidence in them both. If there was any job aloft that needed two hands, they were always the first to jump into the rigging. But that doesn't often happen on a fore and aft schooner. If it breezed up, and the jib-sail was to be taken in, they never minded a wetting, and they would be out at the bowsprit end before there was a hand at the downhaul. The men liked them for that, and because they didn't blow about what they could do. I remember one day in a reefing job, the downhaul parted and came down on deck from the peak of the spanker. When the weather moderated, and we shipped the reefs out, the downhaul was forgotten until we happened to think we might soon need it again. There was some sea on, and the boom was off, and the gaff was slamming. One of those Benton boys was at the wheel. And before I knew what he was doing, the other was out on the gaff with the end of the new downhaul, trying to reeve it through its block. The one who was steering watched him, and got as white as cheese. The other one was swinging about on the gaff end, and every time she rolled to leeward, he brought up with a jerk that would have sent anything but a monkey flying into space. But he didn't leave it until he had rove the new rope. And he got back all right. I think it was Jack at the wheel, the one that seemed more cheerful, the one that whistled Nancy Lee. He had rather have been doing the job himself than watch his brother do it. And he had a scared look, but he kept her as steady as he could in the swell, and he drew a long breath when Jim had worked his way back to the peak halyard block, and had something to hold on to. I think it was Jim. They had good togs, too, and they were neat and clean men in the forecastle. I knew they had nobody belonging to them ashore, no mother, no sisters, and no wives, but somehow they both looked as if a woman overhauled them now and then. I remember that they had one ditty bag between them, and they had a woman's thimble in it. One of the men said something about it to them, and they looked at each other, and one smiled, but the other didn't. Most of their clothes were alike, but they had one red Guernsey between them. For some time I used to think it was always the same one that wore it, and I thought that might be a way to tell them apart. But then I heard one asking the other for it, and saying that the other had worn it last. So that was no sign either. The cook was a West Indiaman, called James Lawley. His father had been hanged for putting lights in coconut trees where they didn't belong. But he was a good cook, and knew his business, and it wasn't soup and bully and dog's body every Sunday. That's what I meant to say. On Sunday, the cook called both those boys Jim, and on weekdays he called them Jack. He used to say he must be right sometimes if he did that, because even the hands on a painted clock point right twice a day. What started me to trying for some way of telling the Bentons apart was this. I heard them talking about a girl. It was at night, in our watch, and the wind had headed us off a little rather suddenly, and when we had flattened in the jibs, we clewed down the topsails, while the two Benton boys got the spanker sheet aft. One of them was at the helm. I coiled down the mizzen topsail downhaul myself, and was going aft to see how she headed up, when I stopped to look at a light, and leaned against the deck house. While I was standing there, I heard the two boys talking. It sounded as if they had talked of the same thing before, and, as far as I could tell, the voice I heard first belonged to the one who wasn't quite so cheerful as the other. The one who was Jim when one knew which he was. "Does Mamie know?" Jim asked. "Not yet," Jack answered quietly. He was at the wheel. "I mean to tell her next time we get home." "All right." That was all I heard, because I didn't care to stand there listening while they were talking about their own affairs, so I went aft to look into the binnacle, and I told the one at the wheel to keep her so as long as she had way on her. For I thought the wind would back up again before long, and there was land to leeward. When he answered, his voice, somehow, didn't sound like the cheerful one. Perhaps his brother had relieved the wheel while they had been speaking. But what I had heard set me wondering which of them it was that had a girl at home. There's lots of time for wondering on a schooner in fair weather. After that I thought I noticed that the two brothers were more silent when they were together. Perhaps they guessed that I had overheard something that night, and kept quiet when I was about. Some men would have amused themselves by trying to chaff them separately about the girl at home, and I suppose whichever one it was would have let the cat out of the bag if I had done that. But, somehow, I didn't like to. Yes, I was thinking of getting married myself at that time, so I had a sort of fellow feeling for whichever one it was, that made me not want to chaff him. They didn't talk much, it seemed to me, but in fair weather, when there was nothing to do at night, and one was steering, the other was everlastingly hanging round as if he were waiting to relieve the wheel, though he might have been enjoying a quiet nap for all I cared in such weather. Or else, when one was taking his turn at the lookout, the other would be sitting on an anchor beside him. One kept near the other, at night more than in the daytime. I noticed that. They were fond of sitting on that anchor. And they generally tucked away their pipes under it, for the _Helen B_ was a dry boat in most weather, and like most fore and afters was better on a wind than going free. With a beam sea, we sometimes shipped a little water aft. We were by the stern, anyhow, on that voyage, and that is one reason why we lost the man. We fell in with a southerly gale, southeast at first, and then the barometer began to fall while you could watch it. And a long swell began to come up from the south'ard. A couple of months earlier we might have been in for a cyclone, but it's October all over in those waters, as you know better than I. It was just going to blow. And then it was to rain, that was all, and we had plenty of time to make everything snug before it breezed up much. It blew harder after sunset, and by the time it was quite dark it was a full gale. We had shortened sail for it, but as we were by the stern we were carrying the spanker close reefed instead of the storm trysail. She steered better so, as long as we didn't have to heave to. I had the first watch with the Benton boys, and we had not been on deck an hour when a child might have seen that the weather meant business. The old man came up on deck and looked round, and in less than a minute he told us to give her the trysail. That meant heaving to, and I was glad of it, for though the _Helen B_ was a good vessel enough, she wasn't a new ship by a long way, and it did her no good to drive her in that weather. I asked whether I should call all hands, but just then the cook came aft, and the old man said he thought we could manage the job without waking the sleepers, and the trysail was handy on deck already. For we hadn't been expecting anything better. We were all in oilskins, of course, and the night was as black as a coal mine, with only a ray of light from the slit in the binnacle shield, and you couldn't tell one man from another except by his voice. The old man took the wheel, we got the boom amidships, and he jammed her into the wind until she had hardly any way. It was blowing now, and it was all that I and two others could do to get in the slack of the downhaul, while the others lowered away at the peak and throat, and we had our hands full to get a couple of turns round the wet sail. It's all child's play on a fore and after compared with reefing topsails in anything like weather. But the gear of a schooner sometimes does unhandy things that you don't expect, and those everlasting long halyards get foul of everything if they get adrift. I remember thinking how unhandy that particular job was. Somebody unhooked the throat halyard block, and thought he had hooked it into the head cringle of the trysail, and sang out to hoist away, but he had missed it in the dark, and the heavy block went flying into the lee rigging, and nearly killed him when it swung back with the weather roll. Then the old man got her up in the wind until the jib was shaking like thunder, then he held her off, and she went off as soon as the headsails filled, and he couldn't get her back again without the spanker. Then the Helen B. did her favorite trick, and before we had time to say much, we had a sea over the quarter and were up to our waists, with the parrels of the trysail only half becket round the mast, and the deck so full of gear that you couldn't put your foot on a plank, and the spanker beginning to get adrift again, being badly stopped, and the general confusion and hell's delight that you can only have on a fore and after when there's nothing really serious the matter. Of course, I don't mean to say that the old man couldn't have steered his trick as well as you or I or any other seaman, but I don't believe he had ever been on board the Helen B. before, or had his hand on her wheel till then, and he didn't know her ways. I don't mean to say that what happened was his fault. I don't know whose fault it was. Perhaps nobody was to blame. But I knew something happened somewhere on board when we shipped that sea, and you'll never get it out of my head. I hadn't any spare time myself, for I was becketing the rest of the trysail to the mast. We were on the starboard tack, and the throat halyard came down to port as usual, and I suppose there were at least 3 men at it, hoisting away, while I was at the beckets. Now I am going to tell you something. You have known me, man and boy, several voyages, and you are older than I am, and you have always been a good friend to me. Now, do you think I am the sort of man to think I hear things where there isn't anything to hear, or to think I see things when there is nothing to see? No, you don't. Thank you. Well now, I had passed the last becket, and I sang out to the men to sway away, and I was standing on the jaws of the spanker gaff, with my left hand on the bolt rope of the trysail, so that I could feel when it was board taut, and I wasn't thinking of anything except being glad the job was over, and that we were going to heave her to. It was as black as a coal pocket, except that you could see the streaks on the seas as they went by, and abaft the deckhouse I could see the ray of light from the binnacle on the captain's yellow oilskin as he stood at the wheel. Or, rather, I might have seen it if I had looked round at that minute. But I didn't look round. I heard a man whistling. It was Nancy Lee, and I could have sworn that the man was right over my head in the crosstrees. Only somehow I knew very well that if anybody could have been up there, and could have whistled a tune, there were no living ears sharp enough to hear it on deck then. I heard it distinctly, and at the same time I heard the real whistling of the wind in the weather rigging. Sharp and clear as the steam whistle on a Dago's peanut cart in New York. That was all right, that was as it should be, but the other wasn't right, and I felt queer and stiff, as if I couldn't move. And my hair was curling against the flannel lining of my sou'wester, and I thought somebody had dropped a lump of ice down my back. I said that the noise of the wind in the rigging was real, as if the other wasn't. For I felt that it wasn't, though I heard it. But it was, all the same, for the captain heard it, too. When I came to relieve the wheel, while the men were clearing up decks, he was swearing. He was a quiet man, and I hadn't heard him swear before, and I don't think I did again, though several queer things happened after that. Perhaps he said all he had to say then. I don't see how he could have said anything more. I used to think nobody could swear like a Dane, except a Neapolitan or a South American, but when I had heard the old man, I changed my mind. There's nothing afloat or ashore that can beat one of your quiet American skippers. If he gets off on that tack. I didn't need to ask him what was the matter, for I knew he had heard Nancy Lee, as I had, only it affected us differently. He did not give me the wheel, but told me to go forward and get the second bonnet off the staysail, so as to keep her up better. As we tailed onto the sheet when it was done, the man next me knocked his sou'wester off against my shoulder, and his face came so close to me that I could see it in the dark. It must have been very white for me to see it, but I only thought of that afterwards. I don't see how any light could have fallen upon it, but I knew it was one of the Benton boys. I don't know what made me speak to him. "Hello, Jim. Is that you?" I asked. I don't know why I said Jim rather than Jack. "I am Jack," he answered. We made all fast, and things were much quieter. "The old man heard you whistling Nancy Lee, just now," I said, "and he didn't like it." It was as if there were a white light inside his face. And it was ghastly. I know his teeth chattered. But he didn't say anything, and the next minute he was somewhere in the dark, trying to find his sou'wester at the foot of the mast. When all was quiet, and she was hove to, coming to and falling off her 4 points as regularly as a pendulum, and the helm lashed a little to the lee, the old man turned in again, and I managed to light a pipe in the lee of the deck house, for there was nothing more to be done till the gale chose to moderate, and the ship was as easy as a baby in its cradle. Of course the cook had gone below, as he might have done an hour earlier. So there were supposed to be 4 of us in the watch. There was a man at the lookout, and there was a hand by the wheel, though there was no steering to be done, and I was having my pipe in the lee of the deck house, and the 4th man was somewhere about decks, probably having a smoke, too. I thought some skippers I had sailed with would have called the watch aft, and given them a drink after that job, but it wasn't cold. And I guessed that our old man wouldn't be particularly generous in that way. My hands and feet were red hot, and it would be time enough to get into dry clothes when it was my watch below, so I stayed where I was. and smoked. But by and by, things being so quiet, I began to wonder why nobody moved on deck, just that sort of restless wanting to know where every man is that one sometimes feels in a gale of wind on a dark night. So when I had finished my pipe, I began to move about. I went aft, and there was a man leaning over the wheel, with his legs apart and both hands hanging down in the light from the binnacle, and his sou'wester over his eyes. Then I went forward, and there was a man at the lookout, with his back against the foremast, getting what shelter he could from the staysail. I knew by his small height that he was not one of the Benton boys. Then I went round by the weather side, and poked about in the dark, for I began to wonder where the other man was. But I couldn't find him, though I searched the decks until I got right aft again. It was certainly one of the Benton boys that was missing, but it wasn't like either of them to go below to change his clothes in such warm weather. The man at the wheel was the other, of course. I spoke to him. "Jim, what's become of your brother?" "I am Jack, sir." "Well, then, Jack, where's Jim?" "He's not on deck." "I don't know, sir." When I had come up to him, he had stood up from force of instinct, and had laid his hands on the spokes as if he were steering, though the wheel was lashed, but he still bent his face down, and it was half hidden by the edge of his sou'wester, while he seemed to be staring at the compass. He spoke in a very low voice. But that was natural, for the captain had left his door open when he turned in, as it was a warm night in spite of the storm, and there was no fear of shipping any more water now. "What put it into your head to whistle like that, Jack? You've been at sea long enough to know better." He said something, but I couldn't hear the words. It sounded as if he were denying the charge. "Somebody whistled," I said. He didn't answer, and then, I don't know why. Perhaps because the old man hadn't given us a drink, I cut half an inch off the plug of tobacco I had in my oilskin pocket, and gave it to him. He knew my tobacco was good, and he shoved it into his mouth with a word of thanks. I was on the weather side of the wheel. "Go forward and see if you can find Jim," I said. He started a little, and then stepped back and passed behind me, and was going along the weather side. Maybe his silence about the whistling had irritated me, and his taking it for granted that because we were hove to and it was a dark night, he might go forward any way he pleased. Anyhow, I stopped him, though I spoke good-naturedly enough. "Pass to leeward, Jack," I said. He didn't answer, but crossed the deck between the binnacle and the deck-house to the lee side. She was only falling off and coming to, and riding the big seas as easily as possible, but the man was not steady on his feet and reeled against the corner of the deck house and then against the lee rail. I was quite sure he couldn't have had anything to drink, for neither of the brothers were the kind to hide rum from their shipmates, if they had any, and the only spirits that were aboard were locked up in the captain's cabin. I wondered whether he had been hit by the throat-halyard block and was hurt. I left the wheel and went after him, but when I got to the corner of the deck-house I saw that he was on a full run forward. So I went back. I watched the compass for a while, to see how far she went off, and she must have come to again half a dozen times before I heard voices, more than 3 or 4, forward. And then I heard the little West Indies cook's voice, high and shrill above the rest, "Man overboard!" There wasn't anything to be done, with the ship hove to and the wheel lashed. If there was a man overboard, he must be in the water right alongside. I couldn't imagine how it could have happened, but I ran forward instinctively. I came upon the cook first, half dressed in his shirt and trousers, just as he had tumbled out of his bunk. He was jumping into the main rigging, evidently hoping to see the man, as if anyone could have seen anything on such a night, except the foam streaks on the black water, and now and then the curl of a breaking sea as it went away to leeward. Several of the men were peering over the rail into the dark. I caught the cook by the foot and asked who was gone. "It's Jim Benton," he shouted down to me. "He's not aboard this ship." There was no doubt about that. Jim Benton was gone, and I knew in a flash that he had been taken off by that sea when we were setting the storm trysail. It was nearly half an hour since then. She had run like wild for a few minutes until we got her hove to. And no swimmer that ever swam could have lived as long as that in such a sea. The men knew it as well as I, but still they stared into the foam as if they had any chance of seeing the lost man. I let the cook get into the rigging and joined the men, and asked if they had made a thorough search on board, though I knew they had and that it could not take long, for he wasn't on deck. And there was only the forecastle below. "That sea took him over, sir, as sure as you're born," said one of the men close beside me. We had no boat that could have lived in that sea, of course, and we all knew it. I offered to put one over, and let her drift astern 2 or 3 cables' lengths by a line, if the men thought they could haul me aboard again, but none of them would listen to that, and I should probably have been drowned if I had tried it. Even with a life belt, for it was a breaking sea. Besides, they all knew as well as I did that the man could not be right in our wake. I don't know why I spoke again. "Jack Benton, are you there? Will you go if I will?" "No, sir," answered a voice, and that was all. By that time the old man was on deck, and I felt his hand on my shoulder rather roughly, as if he meant to shake me. "I'd reckoned you had more sense, Mr. Torkeldsen," he said. "God knows I would risk my ship to look for him, if it were any use, but he must have gone half an hour ago." He was a quiet man, and the men knew he was right. And that they had seen the last of Jim Benton when they were bending the trysail if anybody had seen him then. The captain went below again, and for some time the men stood around Jack, quite near him, without saying anything. As sailors do when they are sorry for a man and can't help him, and then the watch below turned in again, and we were 3 on deck. Nobody can understand that there can be much consolation in a funeral, unless he has felt that blank feeling there is when a man's gone overboard whom everybody likes. I suppose landsmen think it would be easier if they didn't have to bury their fathers and mothers and friends, but it wouldn't. TB. Somehow the funeral keeps up the idea of something beyond. You may believe in that something just the same, but a man who is gone in the dark, between 2 seas, without a cry, seems much more beyond reach than if he were still lying on his bed and had only just stopped breathing. Perhaps Jim Benton knew that, and wanted to come back to us. I don't know, and I am only telling you what happened, and you may think what you like. Jack stuck by the wheel that night until the watch was over. I don't know whether he slept afterwards, but when I came on deck 4 hours later, there he was again, in his oilskins, with his sou'wester over his eyes, staring into the binnacle. We saw that he would rather stand there, and we left him alone. Perhaps it was some consolation to him to get that ray of light when everything was so dark. It began to rain, too, as it can when a southerly gale is going to break up. And we got every bucket and tub on board, and set them under the booms to catch the fresh water for washing our clothes. The rain made it very thick, and I went and stood under the lee of the staysail, looking out. I could tell that day was breaking, because the foam was whiter in the dark where the seas crested, and little by little the black rain grew grey and steamy, and I couldn't see the red glare of the port light on the water when she went off and rolled to leeward. The gale had moderated considerably, and in another hour we should be under way again. I was still standing there when Jack Benton came forward. He stood still a few minutes near me. The rain came down in a solid sheet, and I could see his wet beard and a corner of his cheek, too, grey in the dawn. Then he stooped down and began feeling under the anchor for his pipe. We had hardly shipped any water forward, and I suppose he had some way of tucking the pipe in, so that the rain hadn't floated it off. Presently he got on his legs again, and I saw that he had 2 pipes in his hand. One of them had belonged to his brother, and after looking at them a moment I suppose he recognized his own, for he put it in his mouth, dripping with water. Then he looked at the other fully a minute without moving. When he had made up his mind, I suppose, he quietly chucked it over the lee rail, without even looking round to see whether I was watching him. I thought it was a pity, for it was a good wooden pipe, with a nickel ferrule, and somebody would have been glad to have it. But I didn't like to make any remark, for he had a right to do what he pleased with what had belonged to his dead brother. He blew the water out of his own pipe, and dried it against his jacket, putting his hand inside his oilskin. He filled it, standing under the lee of the foremast, got a light after wasting 2 or 3 matches, and turned the pipe upside down in his teeth, to keep the rain out of the bowl. I don't know why I noticed everything he did, and remember it now, but somehow I felt sorry for him, and I kept wondering whether there was anything I could say that would make him feel better. But I didn't think of anything, and as it was broad daylight I went aft again, for I guessed that the old man would turn out before long and order the spanker set and the helm up. But he didn't. Turn out before 7 bells, just as the clouds broke and showed blue sky to leeward, the Frenchman's barometer, you used to call it. Some people don't seem to be so dead, when they are dead, as others are. Jim Benton was like that. He had been on my watch, and I couldn't get used to the idea that he wasn't about decks with me. I was always expecting to see him, and his brother was so exactly like him that I often felt as if I did see him and forgot he was dead, and made the mistake of calling Jack by his name, though I tried not to, because I knew it must hurt. If ever Jack had been the cheerful one of the two, as I had always supposed he had been, he had changed very much, for he grew to be more silent than Jim had ever been. One fine afternoon I was sitting on the main hatch, overhauling the clockwork of the taffrail log, which hadn't been registering very well of late, and I had got the cook to bring me a coffee cup, to hold the small screws as I took them out, and a saucer for the sperm oil I was going to use. I noticed that he didn't go away, but hung round without exactly watching what I was doing, as if he wanted to say something to me. I thought if it were worth much, he would say it anyhow, so I didn't ask him questions, and sure enough he began of his own accord before long. There was nobody on deck but the man at the wheel, and the other man away forward. Mr. Torkeldsen, the cook began, and then stopped. I supposed he was going to ask me to let the watch break out a barrel of flour, or some salt horse. "Well, doctor?" I asked, as he didn't go on. "Well, Mr. Torkeldsen," he answered, "I somehow want to ask you whether you think I am giving satisfaction on this ship, or not. So far as I know, you are." "Doctor, I haven't heard any complaints from the forecastle, and the captain has said nothing, and I think you know your business, and the cabin boy is bursting out of his clothes. That looks as if you were giving satisfaction. What makes you think you are not? I am not good at giving you that West Indies talk, and shan't try." But the doctor beat about the bush a while, and then he told me he thought the men were beginning to play tricks on him, and he didn't like it, and thought he hadn't deserved it, and would like his discharge at our next port. I told him he was a d.d. fool, of course, to begin with, and that men were more apt to try a joke with a chap they liked than with anybody they wanted to get rid of. Unless it was a bad joke, like flooding his bunk, or filling his boots with tar. But it wasn't that kind of practical joke. The doctor said that the men were trying to frighten him, and he didn't like it, and that they put things in his way that frightened him. So I told him he was a d.d. fool to be frightened, anyway, and I wanted to know what things they put in his way. He gave me a queer answer. He said they were spoons and forks, and odd plates, and a cup now and then, and such things. I set down the taffrail log on the bit of canvas I had put under it, and looked at the doctor. He was uneasy, and his eyes had a sort of hunted look, and his yellow face looked grey. He wasn't trying to make trouble. He was in trouble. So I asked him questions. He said he could count as well as anybody, and do sums without using his fingers, but that when he couldn't count any other way, he did use his fingers, and it always came out the same. He said that when he and the cabin boy cleared up after the men's meals there were more things to wash than he had given out. There'd be a fork more, or there'd be a spoon more, and sometimes there'd be a spoon and a fork, and there was always a plate more. It wasn't that he complained of that. Before poor Jim Benton was lost, they had a man more to feed, and his gear to wash up after meals, and that was in the contract, the doctor said. It would have been if there were 20 in the ship's company, but he didn't think it was right for the men to play tricks like that. He kept his things in good order, and he counted them, and he was responsible for them, and it wasn't right that the men should take more things than they needed when his back was turned, and just soil them and mix them up with their own, so as to make him think. He stopped there, and looked at me, and I looked at him. I didn't know what he thought, but I began to guess. I wasn't going to humor any such nonsense as that, so I told him to speak to the men himself, and not come bothering me about such things. Count the plates and forks and spoons before them when they sit down to table. And tell them that's all they'll get, and when they have finished, count the things again, and if the count isn't right, find out who did it. You know it must be one of them. You're not a green hand. You've been going to see 10 or 11 years, and don't want any lessons about how to behave if the boys play a trick on you. If I could catch him, said the cook, I'd have a knife into him before he could say his prayers. Those West India men are always talking about knives, especially when they are badly frightened. I knew what he meant, and didn't ask him, but went on cleaning the brass cogwheels of the patent log, and oiling the bearings with a feather. Wouldn't it be better to wash it out with boiling water, sir? Asked the cook in an insinuating tone. He knew that he had made a fool of himself, and was anxious to make it right again. I heard no more about the odd platter and gear for 2 or 3 days, though I thought about his story a good deal. The doctor evidently believed that Jim Benton had come back, though he didn't quite like to say so. His story had sounded silly enough on a bright afternoon, in fair weather, when the sun was on the water, and every rag was drawing in the breeze, and the sea looked as pleasant and as harmless as a cat that has just eaten a canary. But when it was toward the end of the first watch, and the waning moon had not risen yet, and the water was like still oil, and the jibs hung down flat and helpless, like the wings of a dead bird, it wasn't the same then. More than once I have started then, and looked round when a fish jumped, expecting to see a face sticking out of the water with its eyes shut. I think we all felt something like that at the time. One afternoon we were putting a fresh service on the jib-sheet pennant. It wasn't my watch, but I was standing by, looking on. Just then Jack Benton came up from below, and went to look for his pipe under the anchor. His face was hard and drawn, and his eyes were cold like steel balls. He hardly ever spoke now, but he did his duty as usual, and nobody had to complain of him, though we were all beginning to wonder how long his grief for his dead brother was going to last like that. I watched him as he crouched down, and ran his hand into the hiding place for the pipe. When he stood up, he had 2 pipes in his hand. Now, I remembered very well seeing him throw one of those pipes away early in the morning after the gale, and it came to me now, and I didn't suppose he kept a stock of them under the anchor. I caught sight of his face, and it was greenish-white, like the foam on shallow water. And he stood a long time looking at the 2 pipes. He wasn't looking to see which was his, for I wasn't 5 yards from him as he stood, and one of those pipes had been smoked that day, and was shiny where his hand had rubbed it, and the bone mouthpiece was chafed white where his teeth had bitten it. The other was waterlogged. It was swelled and cracking with wet, and it looked to me as if there were a little green weed on it. Jack Benton turned his head rather stealthily as I looked away, and then he hid the thing in his trousers pocket, and went aft on the lee side, out of sight. The men had got the sheet pennant on a stretch to serve it, but I ducked under it and stood where I could see what Jack did, just under the forestaysail. He couldn't see me, and he was looking about for something. His hand shook as he picked up a bit of half-bent iron rod, about a foot long, that had been used for turning an eye-bolt, and had been left on the main hatch. His hand shook as he got a piece of marline out of his pocket, and made the water logged pipe fast to the iron. He didn't mean it to get adrift either, for he took his turns carefully, and hove them taut and then rode them, so that they couldn't slip, and made the end fast with 2 half hitches round the iron, and hitched it back on itself. Then he tried it with his hands, and looked up and down the deck furtively, and then quietly dropped the pipe and iron over the rail, so that I didn't even hear the splash. If anybody was playing tricks on board, they weren't meant for the cook. I asked some questions about Jack Benton, and one of the men told me that he was off his feed, and hardly ate anything, and swallowed all the coffee he could lay his hands on, and had used up all his own tobacco, and had begun on what his brother had left. "The doctor says it ain't so, sir," said the man, looking at me shyly, as if he didn't expect to be believed. "The doctor says there's as much eaten from breakfast to breakfast as there was before Jim fell overboard, though there's a mouth less and another that eats nothing." I says it's the cabin boy that gets it. He's boosting. I told him that if the cabin boy ate more than his share, he must work more than his share, so as to balance things. But the man laughed queerly, and looked at me again. "I only said that, sir, just like that. We all know it ain't so." "Well, how is it? How is it?" asked the man, half angry all at once. "I don't know how it is, but there's a hand on board that's getting his whack along with us as regular as the bells." "Does he use tobacco?" I asked, meaning to laugh it out of him, but as I spoke, I remembered the waterlogged pipe. "I guess he's using his own still," the man answered, in a queer, low voice. "Perhaps he'll take someone else when his is all gone." It was about 9 o'clock in the morning, I remember, for just then the captain called to me to stand by the chronometer while he took his fore observation. Captain Hackstaff wasn't one of those old skippers who do everything themselves with a pocket watch, and keep the key of the chronometer in their waistcoat pocket, and won't tell the mate how far the dead reckoning is out. He was rather the other way, and I was glad of it, for he generally let me work the sights he took, and just ran his eye over my figures afterwards. I am bound to say his eye was pretty good, for he would pick out a mistake in a logarithm, or tell me that I had worked the equation of time with the wrong sign, before it seemed to me that he could have got as far as half the sum, minus the altitude. He was always right, too, and besides he knew a lot about iron ships and local deviation, and adjusting the compass, and all that sort of thing. I don't know how he came to be in command of a fore and aft schooner. He never talked about himself, and maybe he had just been made on one of those big steel square riggers, and something had put him back. Perhaps he had been captain, and had got his ship aground, through no particular fault of his, and had to begin over again. Sometimes he talked just like you and me, and sometimes he would speak more like books do, or some of those Boston people I have heard. I don't know. We have all been shipmates now, and then with men who have seen better days. Perhaps he had been in the Navy, but what makes me think he couldn't have been, was that he was a thorough good seaman, a regular old windjammer, and understood sail, which those Navy chaps rarely do. Why, you and I have sailed with men before the mast who had their master's certificates in their pockets. English Board of Trade Certificates, 2 who could work a double altitude if you would lend them a sextant and give them a look at the chronometer, as well as many a man who commands a big square rigger. Navigation ain't everything. Nor seamanship either. You've got to have it in you, if you mean to get there. I don't know how our captain heard that there was trouble forward. The cabin boy may have told him, or the men may have talked outside his door when they relieved the wheel at night. Anyhow, he got wind of it, and when he had got his sight that morning, he had all hands aft, and gave them a lecture. It was just the kind of talk you might have expected from him. He said he hadn't any complaint to make, and that so far as he knew everybody on board was doing his duty, and that he was given to understand that the men got their whack, and were satisfied. He said his ship was never a hard ship, and that he liked quiet, and that was the reason he didn't mean to have any nonsense, and the men might just as well understand that, too. We'd had a great misfortune, he said, and it was nobody's fault. We had lost a man we all liked and respected, and he felt that everybody in the ship ought to be sorry for the man's brother, who was left behind, and that it was rotten lubberly childishness, and unjust and unmanly and cowardly, to be playing schoolboy tricks with forks and spoons and pipes, and that sort of gear. He said it had got to stop right now, and that was all, and the men might go forward. And so they did. It got worse after that, and the men watched the cook, and the cook watched the men, as if they were trying to catch each other, but I think everybody felt that there was something else. One evening, at supper time, I was on deck, and Jack came aft to relieve the wheel, while the man who was steering got his supper. He hadn't got past the main hatch on the lee side, when I heard a man running in slippers that slapped on the deck. And there was a sort of a yell, and I saw the colored cook going for Jack, with a carving knife in his hand. I jumped to get between them, and Jack turned round short, and put out his hand. I was too far to reach them, and the cook jabbed out with his knife. But the blade didn't get anywhere near Benton. The cook seemed to be jabbing it into the air again and again, at least 4 feet short of the mark. Then he dropped his right hand, and I saw the whites of his eyes in the dusk, and he reeled up against the pin rail, and caught hold of a belaying pin with his left. I had reached him by that time, and grabbed hold of his knife hand, and the other, too, for I thought he was going to use the pin, but Jack Benton was standing staring stupidly at him, as if he didn't understand. But instead, the cook was holding on, because he couldn't stand, and his teeth were chattering, and he let go of the knife, and the point stuck into the deck. "He's crazy," said Jack Benton, and that was all he said, and he went aft. When he was gone, the cook began to come to, and he spoke quite low, near my ear. There were 2 of them. So help me God, there were 2 of them. I don't know why I didn't take him by the collar, and give him a good shaking, but I didn't. I just picked up the knife and gave it to him, and told him to go back to his galley, and not to make a fool of himself. You see, he hadn't struck at Jack, but at something he thought he saw. And I knew what it was, and I felt that same thing, like a lump of ice sliding down my back, that I felt that night when we were bending the trysail. When the men had seen him running aft, they jumped up after him, but they held off when they saw that I had caught him. By and by, the man who had spoken to me before told me what had happened. He was a stocky little chap with a red head. Well, he said, there isn't much to tell. Jack Benton had been eating his supper with the rest of us. He always sits at the after corner of the table, on the port side. His brother used to sit at the end, next him. The doctor gave him a thundering big piece of pie to finish up with, and when he had finished he didn't stop for a smoke, but went off quick to relieve the wheel. Just as he had gone, the doctor came in from the galley, and when he saw Jack's empty plate he stood stock still staring at it, and we all wondered what was the matter, till we looked at the plate. There were 2 forks in it, sir, lying side by side. Then the doctor grabbed his knife, and flew up through the hatch like a rocket. The other fork was there all right, Mr. Torkeldsen, for we all saw it and handled it, and we all had our own. That's all I know. I didn't feel that I wanted to laugh when he told me that story, but I hoped the old man wouldn't hear it, for I knew he wouldn't believe it, and no captain that ever sailed likes to have stories like that going round about his ship. It gives her a bad name. But that was all anybody ever saw except the cook, and he isn't the first man who has thought he saw things without having any drink in him. I think, if the doctor had been weak in the head, as he was afterwards, he might have done something foolish again, and there might have been serious trouble. But he didn't. Only 2 or 3 times, I saw him looking at Jack Benton in a queer, scared way, and once I heard him talking to himself. There's 2 of them. So help me God, there's 2 of them. He didn't say anything more about asking for his discharge, but I knew well enough that if he got ashore at the next port, we should never see him again. If he had to leave his kit behind him, and his money, too. He was scared all through, for good and all, and he wouldn't be right again till he got another ship. It's no use to talk to a man when he gets like that, any more than it is to send a boy to the main truck when he has lost his nerve. Jack Benton never spoke of what happened that evening. I don't know whether he knew about the 2 forks, or not, or whether he understood what the trouble was. Whatever he knew from the other men, he was evidently living under a hard strain. He was quiet enough, and too quiet, but his face was set, and sometimes it twitched oddly when he was at the wheel. And he would turn his head round sharp to look behind him. A man doesn't do that naturally, unless there's a vessel that he thinks is creeping up on the quarter. When that happens, if the man at the wheel takes a pride in his ship, he will almost always keep glancing over his shoulder to see whether the other fellow is gaining. But Jack Benton used to look round when there was nothing there, and what is curious, the other men seemed to catch the trick when they were steering. One day the old man turned out just as the man at the wheel looked behind him. "What are you looking at?" asked the captain. "Nothing, sir," answered the man. "Then keep your eye on the mizzen royal," said the old man, as if he were forgetting that we were in ta squarrigger. "Aye, sir," said the man. The captain told me to go below and work up the latitude from the dead reckoning, and he went forward of the deck-house and sat down to read, as he often did. When I came up, The man at the wheel was looking round again, and I stood beside him and just asked him quietly what everybody was looking at, for it was getting to be a general habit. He wouldn't say anything at first, but just answered that it was nothing. But when he saw that I didn't seem to care, and just stood there as if there were nothing more to be said, he naturally began to talk. He said that it wasn't that he saw anything, because there wasn't anything to see except the spanker sheet just straining a little, and working in the sheaves of the blocks as the schooner rose to the short seas. There wasn't anything to be seen. But it seemed to him that the sheet made a queer noise in the blocks. It was a new manila sheet, and in dry weather it did make a little noise, something between a creak and a wheeze. I looked at it and looked at the man, and said nothing, and presently he went on. He asked me if I didn't notice anything peculiar about the noise. I listened a while, and said I didn't notice anything. Then he looked rather sheepish, but said he didn't think it could be his own ears, because every man who steered his trick heard the same thing now and then, sometimes once in a day, sometimes once in a night, sometimes it would go on a whole hour. It sounds like sawing wood, I said, just like that. To us it sounds a good deal more like a man whistling Nancy Lee. He started nervously as he spoke the last words. There, sir, don't you hear it? He asked, suddenly. I heard nothing but the creaking of the manila sheet. It was getting near noon, and fine, clear weather in southern waters, just the sort of day and the time when you would least expect to feel creepy. But I remembered how I had heard that same tune overhead at night in a gale of wind a fortnight earlier. And I am not ashamed to say that the same sensation came over me now, and I wished myself well out of the _Helen B_ and aboard of any old cargo dragger, with a windmill on deck, and an 8948er for captain, and a fresh leak whenever it breezed up. Little by little during the next few days life on board that vessel came to be about as unbearable as you can imagine. It wasn't that there was much talk, for I think the men were shy even of speaking to each other freely about what they thought. The whole ship's company grew silent, until one hardly ever heard a voice, except giving an order and the answer. The men didn't sit over their meals when their watch was below, but either turned in at once or sat about on the forecastle, smoking their pipes without saying a word. We were all thinking of the same thing. We all felt as if there were a hand on board, sometimes below, sometimes about decks, sometimes aloft, sometimes on the boom end, taking his full share of what the others got, but doing no work for it. We didn't only feel it, we knew it. He took up no room, he cast no shadow, and we never heard his footfall on deck, but he took his whack with the rest as regular as the bells. And he whistled Nancy Lee. It was like the worst sort of dream you can imagine, and I dare say a good many of us tried to believe it was nothing else sometimes, when we stood looking over the weather rail in fine weather with the breeze in our faces. But if we happened to turn round and look into each other's eyes, we knew it was something worse than any dream could be, and we would turn away from each other with a queer, sick feeling, wishing that we could just for once see somebody who didn't know what we knew. There's not much more to tell about the Helen B. Jackson _, so far as I am concerned. We were more like a shipload of lunatics than anything else when we ran in under Morro Castle and anchored in Havana. The cook had brain fever, and was raving mad in his delirium, and the rest of the men weren't far from the same state. The last 3 or 4 days had been awful, and we had been as near to having a mutiny on board as I ever want to be. The men didn't want to hurt anybody, but they wanted to get away out of that ship, if they had to swim for it, to get away from that whistling, from that dead shipmate who had come back, and who filled the ship with his unseen self. I know that if the old man and I hadn't kept a sharp lookout, the men would have put a boat over quietly on one of those calm nights, and pulled away, leaving the captain and me and the mad cook to work the schooner into harbor. We should have done it somehow, of course, for we hadn't far to run if we could get a breeze, and once or twice I found myself wishing that the crew were really gone, for the awful state of fright in which they lived was beginning to work on me too. You see, I partly believed and partly didn't, but, anyhow, I didn't mean to let the thing get the better of me, whatever it was. I turned crusty, too, and kept the men at work on all sorts of jobs. And drove them to it until they wished I was overboard, too. It wasn't that the old man and I were trying to drive them to desert without their pay, as I am sorry to say a good many skippers and mates do. Even now. Captain Hackstaff was as straight as a string, and I didn't mean those poor fellows should be cheated out of a single cent, and I didn't blame them for wanting to leave the ship. But it seemed to me that the only chance to keep everybody sane through those last days was to work the men till they dropped. When they were dead tired, they slept a little, and forgot the thing until they had to tumble up on deck and face it again. That was a good many years ago. Do you believe that I can't hear Nancy Lee now, without feeling cold down my back? For I heard it, too, now and then, after the man had explained why he was always looking over his shoulder. Perhaps it was imagination. I don't know. When I look back, it seems to me that I only remember a long fight against something I couldn't see, against an appalling presence, against something worse than cholera or yellow jack or the plague. And, goodness knows, the mildest of them is bad enough when it breaks out at sea. The men got as white as chalk, and wouldn't go about decks alone at night, no matter what I said to them. With the cook raving in his bunk. The forecastle would have been a perfect hell, and there wasn't a spare cabin on board. There never is on a fore and after. So I put him into mine, and he was more quiet there, and at last fell into a sort of stupor as if he were going to die. I don't know what became of him, for we put him ashore alive and left him in the hospital. The men came aft in a body, quiet enough, and asked the captain if he wouldn't pay them off, and let them go ashore. Some men wouldn't have done it, for they had shipped for the voyage, and had signed articles. But the captain knew that when sailors get an idea into their heads, they're no better than children, and if he forced them to stay aboard, he wouldn't get much work out of them, and couldn't rely on them in a difficulty. So he paid them off, and let them go. When they had gone forward to get their kits, he asked me whether I wanted to go, too, and for a minute I had a sort of weak feeling that I might just as well. But I didn't, and he was a good friend to me afterwards. Perhaps he was grateful to me for sticking to him. When the men went off, he didn't come on deck, but it was my duty to stand by while they left the ship. They owed me a grudge for making them work during the last few days, and most of them dropped into the boat without so much as a word or a look. As sailors will. Jack Benton was the last to go over the side, and he stood still a minute and looked at me, and his white face twitched. I thought he wanted to say something. "Take care of yourself, Jack," said I. "So long." It seemed as if he couldn't speak for 2 or 3 seconds, then his words came thick. "It wasn't my fault, Mr. Torkeldsen. I swear it wasn't my fault." That was all, and he dropped over the side, leaving me to wonder what he meant. The captain and I stayed on board, and the ship chandler got a West India boy to cook for us. That evening, before turning in, we were standing by the rail, having a quiet smoke, watching the lights of the city, a quarter of a mile off, reflected in the still water. There was music of some sort ashore, in a sailor's dance house, I dare say, and I had no doubt that most of the men who had left the ship were there, and already full of jiggy-jiggy. The music played a lot of sailors' tunes that ran into each other, and we could hear the men's voices in the chorus now and then. One followed another, and then it was Nancy Lee, loud and clear, and the men singing yo-ho, heave-ho. "I have no ear for music," said Captain Hackstaff, "but it appears to me that's the tune that man was whistling the night we lost the man overboard. I don't know why it has stuck in my head. And of course it's all nonsense, but it seems to me that I have heard it all the rest of the trip." I didn't say anything to that, but I wondered just how much the old man had understood. Then we turned in, and I slept 10 hours without opening my eyes. I stuck to the _Hellenby. Jackson after that as long as I could stand a fore and after, but that night when we lay in Havana was the last time I ever heard Nancy Lee on board of her. The spare hand had gone ashore with the rest, and he never came back, and he took his tune with him, but all those things are just as clear in my memory as if they had happened yesterday. After that I was in deep water for a year or more, and after I came home I got my certificate, and what with having friends and having saved a little money, and having had a small legacy from an uncle in Norway, I got the command of a coastwise vessel, with a small share in her. I was at home 3 weeks before going to sea, and Jack Benton saw my name in the local papers, and wrote to me. He said that he had left the sea, and was trying farming, and he was going to be married, and he asked if I wouldn't come over for that, for it wasn't more than 40 minutes by train, and he and Mamie would be proud to have me at the wedding. I remembered how I had heard one brother ask the other whether Mamie knew. That meant, whether she knew he wanted to marry her, I suppose. She had taken her time about it, for it was pretty nearly 3 years then since we had lost Jim Benton overboard. I had nothing particular to do while we were getting ready for sea, nothing to prevent me from going over for a day, I mean, and I thought I'd like to see Jack Benton, and have a look at the girl he was going to marry. I wondered whether he had grown cheerful again, and had got rid of that drawn look he had when he told me it wasn't his fault. How could it have been his fault, anyhow? So I wrote to Jack that I would come down and see him married.